Chapter 22-29. Xiao Luan took the initiative to introduce Qin Xian. Xiao Chen looked at his daughter strangely, but he still turned to Qin Xian and smiled. Qin Xian, right? Don't be shy. Have a seat. Xiao Luan introduced Qin Xian. Xiao Chen looked at his daughter strangely, but he still turned to Qin Xian and smiled. Qin Xian, right? Don't be shy. Have a seat. Xiao Chen appeared to be very easygoing, but even so, Qin Xian still appeared to be very nervous, so much so that he was at a loss for what to do. Xiao Chen didn't reveal any aura, nor did he take the initiative to exert any pressure on Qin Xian. Even so, Qin Xian still felt immense pressure when facing Xiao Chen. It was almost unbearable. Qin Xian couldn't be blamed. Not to mention Qin Xian, even the patriarch of the Qin clan would feel nervous in front of Xiao Chen. Qin Xian's reaction was normal. The reason why Xiao Luan brought Qin Xian here was to tell him about her background. Qin Xian had asked about Xiao Luan's identity in a roundabout way, but Xiao Luan had never answered him directly. Today, Qin Xian took the initiative to confess to Xiao Luan, so Xiao Luan decided to tell him everything. Xiao Luan didn't dislike Qin Xian, but it was still too early to say that she liked him. Moreover, if Qin Xian wanted to pursue her, he had to get past her family no matter what. If he couldn't even get past her family, how could Qin Xian be qualified to pursue Xiao Luan? Although Xiao Luan had never been in a relationship before, she was naturally intelligent and knew that everything depended on Qin Xian. Therefore, she remained silent at the side. Qin Xian instinctively sat opposite Xiao Chen, but even so, his back was still straight and he looked like a block of wood. He did not dare to meet Xiao Chen's eyes. Seeing Qin Xian's appearance, Xiao Chen smiled slightly and personally made a cup of tea for him. Then, he said with a smile, "My daughter has been spoiled by her mothers since she was young. It has been hard on you during this period." As the sect master of the sword sect, Xiao Chen spoke casually, but Qin Xian hurriedly interjected. No, sect master, you're exaggerating." Qin Xian was unable to send the message. Xiao Chen could only smile bitterly. At the same time, Qin Shuru and Flower Fairy also arrived. Clearly, they knew that Xiao Luan had brought Qin Xian back. Qin Shuru and Flower Fairy knew everything about Qin Xian like the back of their hands. The information about Qin Xian's childhood had also been placed in front of them. This was their first official meeting with Qin Xian. However, compared to Xiao Chen, Qin Shuru and Flower Fairy did not seem to think highly of Qin Xian. Naturally, their expressions were not as casual as Xiao Chen's. Although Qin Shuiro did not criticize Qin Xian directly, the two women did not have much of an expression on their faces when they arrived. They sat down on either side of Xiao Chen. Then, Qin Shuiro whispered to Xiao Luan. "You're fooling around again. You even brought him back home." Qin Shuru and Flower Fairy naturally knew about the relationship between Qin Xian and Xiao Luan. They knew that Qin Xian had been pursuing Xiao Luan. However, Qin Shuru and the other women obviously did not like Qin Xian. Men and women had completely different thoughts on the same matter. For example, Xiao Chen did not mind at all. However, Qin Shuru and the other women were very cautious. After being scolded by Qin Shuru, Xiao Luan lowered her head in grievance. Seeing this, Qin Shuru did not say anything. Instead, he looked at Qin Xian and asked, "Qin Xian, don't be nervous. We have heard a little about you and Luan Luan. After all, Luan Luan is our daughter. Naturally, we have to care about her. May I know your purpose for coming here today?" Qin Xian did not know Qin Xian's purpose for coming here. Hearing this, Qin Xian did not know how to answer. Ever since he found out about Xiao Luan's identity, Qin Xian's head had been buzzing. He could not calm down at all. Qin Xian did not know how to answer and could only choose to remain silent. Fortunately, Xiao Chen interrupted at this moment. "All right, let's not add to the trouble of the children. Let Luan Luan and the others settle it themselves." Xiao Chen saw Qin Xian's nervousness and directly left with Qin Shuru and Flower Fairy, leaving Xiao Luan and Flower Fairy alone. Although Qin Shuru and Flower Fairy were unwilling to leave, since Xiaochen had spoken, the two women could only obey. They got up and disappeared on the spot. After leaving the bamboo forest and returning to the courtyard, Flower Fairy said coquettishly, "What do you mean? Why do you have to make us leave? You too. Didn't you see how nervous that kid from the Qin family was? What can you get out of him if you continue to ask?" In response, Xiaochen said helplessly with a bitter smile. Qin Shuru and Flower Fairy would not be able to get anything out of Qin Xian's state just now. It was better to let the two of them talk on their own. Xiaochen did not want to interfere too much. After all, Xiao Luan was no longer a child. She had her own thoughts. Most of the time, it was not necessarily a good thing to interfere too much. After hearing Xiaochen's words, Qin Shuru and Flower Fairy rolled their eyes at Xiaochen. Then, they did not say anything else and left. Seeing the two women leave, Xiaochen shook his head and smiled bitterly. Who did he offend? It was as if he was a bad person. After Xiaochen left with Qin Shuru and Flower Fairy, Qin Xian felt a lot more relaxed. Looking at Xiao Luan, Qin Xian hesitated for a while and finally asked in disappointment. Sect Master Xiaochen, is he really your father? Yes. Xiao Luan nodded without the slightest hesitation. After knowing Xiao Luan's identity, Qin Xian felt a lot of pressure. Previously, when he was with Xiao Luan, Qin Xian thought that with his family background, he would never let Xiao Luan suffer any grievances, nor would he owe her anything. But now, it seemed that his thoughts were laughable. With Xiao Luan's identity, his identity as the young master of the Qin family was not worth mentioning at all. If Xiao Luan were to marry him in the future, it would be the same as marrying someone of a lower status. Qin Xian's gaze was complicated because Xiao Luan's identity was far beyond his expectations. After staring at Xiao Luan for a long time, Qin Xian finally gave up. You're telling me all this because you want me to back off and give up on my unrealistic thoughts? Qin Xian could not be blamed for having such thoughts. Anyone who encountered such a situation would inevitably have such thoughts. Therefore, it was not strange for Qin Xian to have such thoughts. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 2230. Qin Xian felt that Xiao Luan was telling him all this just to make him back off. However, Xiao Luan shook his head and said, "Don't worry about it." Qin Xian felt that Xiao Luan was telling him all this just to make him back off. However, Xiao Luan shook his head and said, "Don't worry about it. That's not what I meant. I admit that I don't like you, but I don't hate you either. As for your sudden confession, I really don't know how to handle it. So before I think it through, I hope that you can confirm your thoughts. Will you really be able to do what you said regardless of what kind of person I am?" Xiao Luan's thoughts weren't what Qin Xian said. Of course, if Qin Xian chose to give up because of this, Xiao Luan wouldn't say anything. After all, Xiao Luan didn't have any special feelings for Qin Xian. If Qin Xian continued to persist, perhaps Xiao Luan would be able to make up her mind and make her own choice one day in the future. Qin Xian took a deep look at Xiao Luan before standing up and mocking himself. You've given me such a huge surprise. I think I need to calm down. Xiaochen and Qin Shuru had left, leaving Xiao Luan alone. As a result, the pressure on Qin Xian was reduced by a lot. However, his heart was still in a mess, so Qin Xian needed to calm down by himself. Xiao Luan nodded slightly and personally sent Qin Xian out of the cave dwelling. She watched as Qin Xian left before turning around to return to the cave dwelling. Qin Xian didn't know how to choose, and this was actually what Xiao Luan was happy to see. If Qin Xian's first reaction after knowing her identity was to agree, perhaps Xiao Luan would be even more disappointed. Because such an answer didn't represent how much Qin Xian liked Xiao Luan, but rather, Qin Xian was interested in Xiao Luan's background. This wasn't the result that Xiao Luan wanted. Fortunately, Qin Xian didn't do that. Or perhaps, Qin Xian really had feelings for Xiao Luan, which was why he neglected Xiao Luan's background. Even though Xiao Wan had openly revealed his identity to Qin Xian and he knew that Xiao Wan's identity could allow Qin Xian to reach the top in a single bound, Qin Xian still didn't care about this. Or rather, his focus wasn't on this. Qin Xian didn't even know how he returned to his residence. He only knew that after leaving Xiao Wan's place, he was walking in a daze. Unknowingly, he arrived outside his residence. It was a small courtyard, but the scenery was very good. This was the residence that the sword sect prepared for Qin Xian and his second uncle. It was located in the outer area of the sword sect and was used to entertain guests. After going out for such a long time, the sky had already darkened. Qin Xian returned in a daze. Seeing this, Qin Xian's second uncle walked up to support Qin Xian's body with a puzzled expression. "Xianer, what happened to you?" Qin Xian's condition clearly wasn't right. Tomorrow was the third round's battle for the top 10. At this moment, Qin Xian's second uncle obviously couldn't bring out his strongest strength. This was why Qin Xian's second uncle was so worried. After helping Qin Xian sit down in the pavilion in the courtyard, he personally poured a cup of tea for Qin Xian. After watching Qin Xian drink it in one gulp, his second uncle continued to ask. "Xianer, what happened to you? Where did you go just now?" Qin Xian's second uncle continued to ask. Qin Xian's second uncle was still fine. How did he become like this after going out? Under his second uncle's interrogation, Qin Xian finally spoke. "I went to Xiao Wan's house just now." "Xiao Wan's house?" Qin Xian's second uncle was startled. Although the Qin family had used all their resources to investigate Xiao Wan, they still didn't find anything. And now, Qin Xian actually said that he went to Xiao Wan's house. He was even more puzzled. At the same time, he asked curiously, "Xiao Wan's house is in the sword sect? What's her identity?" This was the sword sect. Besides, Qin Xian's second uncle also heard that Xiao Wan's family wasn't among the guests. So why was Xiao Wan's house in the sword sect? Could it be that, just like Qin Xian, his second uncle guessed that Xiao Wan's family couldn't be a deacon or elder in the sword sect, right? This was the only explanation why Xiao Wan's house was in the sword sect. However, Qin Xian's next sentence also caused his second uncle to be stunned on the spot. Qin Xian spoke in a neither hurried nor slow manner. "Xiao Wan's father is sect master Xiaochen. Xiao Wan was Xiao Chen's daughter." Hearing this, Qin Xian's second uncle was stunned. He stood there motionless and said in disbelief after a long while, "That's right. Xianer, this isn't a joke. Sect master Xiaochen isn't our Qin family's." He thought that Qin Xian was joking. But shortly after, Qin Xian said with certainty, "I'm not joking. I went to Xiao Wan's house and saw sect master Xiaochen. He is Xiao Wan's father." Qin Xian definitely wasn't joking about this matter. Qin Xian's second uncle was speechless. No wonder the Qin family couldn't find any traces of Xiao Wan even after mobilizing so much manpower. So that's the reason. It would be strange if the Qin family could find out anything about Xiao Chen's daughter. Previously, Qin Xian's second uncle thought that Xiao Wan was at most a descendant of an aristocratic family. But in terms of strength, she definitely couldn't be compared to the Qin family. Therefore, Qin Xian's second uncle looked down on Xiao Wan. But now, Xiao Wan was actually Xiao Chen's daughter. Qin Xian's second uncle was shocked when he thought about how he looked down on Xiao Wan. "Xianer, since that's the case, then why did I?" Qin Xian's second uncle panicked when he thought about how he looked down on Xiao Wan. He was afraid that Xiao Wan would take revenge. After all, with Xiao Wan's status, it was easy for her to persuade a vice sect master of the sword sect to deal with the Qin family. Even if the Qin family had 3 End Realm ancestors, they wouldn't be able to resist a vice sect master of the sword sect. At the very least, they would be severely injured. Qin Xian's heart was filled with fear. But compared to her second uncle, Qin Xian appeared calm. "Don't worry, Xiao Wan isn't such a person. Besides, if she really holds a grudge, do you think you can still stand here and talk to me?" She didn't think that Xiao Wan would take revenge on her second uncle because of such a small matter. Moreover, even if she wanted to take revenge, she would have done it long ago. Why would she wait until now? After telling her second uncle not to worry, Qin Xian walked back to her room. Leaving behind a simple sentence, she returned to her room. I'm a little frustrated. Second uncle, please don't disturb me. Let me think about it. Begging to be added, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. Swordmaster 8 Desolation will continue to update on Green Doe. There are no advertisements on the website. Please add and recommend Green Doe. If you like Swordmaster 8 Desolation, please add. Swordmaster 8 Desolation Green Doe updates the fastest. Chapter 2231. Today, Xiao Wan had truly shocked Qin Xian. Facing Xiao Wan, who had such a background, Qin Xian naturally couldn't be as relaxed as before. In front of Xiao Wan, Qin Xian's status as the young master of the Qin clan was simply too weak. Today, Xiao Wan had truly shocked Qin Xian. Facing Xiao Wan, who had such a background, Qin Xian naturally couldn't be as relaxed as before. In front of Xiao Wan, Qin Xian's status as the young master of the Qin clan was simply too weak. Qin Xian needed to be alone. Regarding this, Qin Xian's second uncle was also stunned in the courtyard. He was still shocked by Xiao Wan's identity. He had never imagined that Xiao Wan was actually Xiao Chen's daughter. However, after recovering from his shock, Qin Xian's second uncle suddenly recalled that Qin Xian was currently pursuing Xiao Wan. Looking at Xiao Wan's appearance, it seemed like she didn't hate Qin Xian. In that case, if Qin Xian and Xiao Wan could really fall in love with each other, wouldn't the Qin clan and Xiaochen become in-laws? For the Qin family, there were obviously many benefits. After all, the in-laws were equivalent to a family. Thinking of this, Qin Xian's second uncle was elated. He immediately sent a message to his elder brother, who was Qin Xian's father and the current patriarch of the Qin clan. Far away from the Sword Mansion, in a beautiful garden of the Qin clan, the patriarch of the Qin clan was cultivating with his eyes closed. Suddenly, a golden ray of light from a sound transmission talisman entered his head. Needless to say, this voice transmission talisman belonged to Qin Xian's second uncle. After knowing the contents of the voice transmission talisman, the patriarch of the Qin clan abruptly opened his eyes. Evidently, he was shocked. The content of the letter was naturally related to Xiao Wan and Qin Xian. Furthermore, it clearly introduced Xiao Wan's status. The daughter of the Sword sect leader, Xiaochen, Xiao Wan actually had such an identity. In that case, if Qin Xian could successfully pursue Xiao Wan, it would be a great contribution to the Qin clan. After being shocked, the patriarch of the Qin clan revealed an excited smile. He didn't expect such a thing to happen. After pacing back and forth and pondering for a moment, Patriarch Qin quickly replied. He told Qin Xian's second uncle that there was no need to do anything for the time being. Qin Xian and Xiao Wan should just wait and see. Although he knew what benefits Xiao Wan would bring to the Qin clan if she married into the Qin clan, the old and shrewd Master Qin also knew that Xiao Wan's identity was very sensitive. If the Qin clan had any tricks up their sleeves, it would be self-defeating. At that time, if they angered Xiaochen, not only would the Qin family not get any benefits, they would also have to prepare for Xiaochen's anger. Therefore, it wasn't appropriate for the other members of the Qin family to make any moves at this time. Qin Xian should handle everything himself. As for the final result, it would depend on the fate of the two. In short, he couldn't let Xiaochen think that Qin Xian was pursuing Xiao Wan with ulterior motives. It wouldn't benefit Qin Xian or the entire Qin clan. Patriarch Qin had indeed made the right choice. At this time, it wasn't appropriate for the Qin clan to make any moves. In the Sword sect, Qin Xian's second uncle soon received Patriarch Qin's reply. After understanding his elder brother's intentions, Qin Xian's second uncle stood up and returned to his room to rest. Although Qin Xian had given the Qin clan a huge surprise by hooking up with Xiaochen's daughter, the Qin clan was calmer at this time. It wasn't unreasonable for the Qin clan to be able to survive for so many generations. At the very least, the person in charge of the Qin clan was very clear-headed. he knew when to make the right choice. It was also because of this that the Qin clan had made the right choice time and time again, allowing the Qin clan to maintain its prosperity. Although Xiao Wan's identity was very attractive, the Qin clan didn't have to make any moves in the dark. This was because not only would there be no benefits, but it would also make Xiaochen feel disgusted. The losses outweighed the gains. The Qin clan didn't make any moves and left everything to Qin Xian. As for the final result, it was up to the heavens. The Qin clan didn't make any movements at all, and the night was silent. Early the next morning, the third round of the ranking tournament would begin. Once again, they arrived at the main square. However, on this day, only one of the original 10 arenas remained. It stood at the center of the square. Qin Xian came with his second uncle. As soon as he arrived, he looked around. As expected, he soon saw Xiao Wan's figure. Qin Xian didn't deliberately avoid her and greeted her as usual. Xiao Wan. Seeing Qin Xian, Xiao Wan casually smiled and nodded. The two of them didn't mention what happened yesterday. Qin Xian also didn't do anything special. They stood side by side and chatted casually. After thinking for an entire day yesterday, Qin Xian still couldn't come up with an answer. Until now, Qin Xian still didn't know what decision he had made. In the end, he could only take one step at a time. Let nature take its course. Just as Qin Xian and Xiao Wan were chatting, Xiaochen, Sang Xing, and a few other deputy sect leaders slowly appeared on the high platform in the main square. Xiaochen was indeed present for today's ranking battle. When everyone saw Xiaochen, they hurriedly bowed respectfully. In response, Xiaochen revealed a faint smile and waved his hand. "Everyone, please take a seat. Today is the last day of the recruitment competition. Everyone present is the cream of the crop among the hundreds of thousands of people. I hope that all of you will be able to display your full strength without holding back and obtain a good ranking," Xiaochen said calmly. Seeing Xiaochen again, Qin Xian realized that even though it was his first time facing Xiaochen, he still couldn't help but feel nervous. Even though they were so far apart, Xiao Wan was able to make him feel so simple. It was hard to imagine how he would feel when facing Xiaochen in the future if he really got together with Xiao Wan. Having such a powerful father-in-law wasn't necessarily a good thing. Of course, nothing was set in stone yet. It was still too early to talk about this. Compared to the others, Qin Xian obviously had more thoughts in his mind when facing Xiaochen. At the same time, Qin Xian's second uncle also had the same thoughts when looking at Xiaochen on the high platform. He also knew about the relationship between Xiao Wan and Qin Xian. When he thought about the possibility of the two of them being together in the future, he couldn't help but have other thoughts when he looked at Xiaochen, who was sitting on the main seat. Although his elder brother had already given the order to not let the other members of the Qin clan do anything, this didn't stop him from fantasizing about it. Looking at Xiaochen on the high platform, Qin Xian's second uncle couldn't help but think that if Xiao Wan and Qin Xian really got together, then the Qin clan and the Xiao clan would become the Qin clan. At that time, the Qin clan would have a powerful backer like the Sword Sect. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 2232. Other than Qin Xian and his nephew, none of the other young cultivators present knew of Xiao Wan's identity. After a few simple words, Xiaochen handed everything over to Lin Qing. Other than Qin Xian and his nephew, none of the other young cultivators present knew of Xiao Wan's identity. After a few simple words, Xiaochen handed everything over to Lin Qing. Lin Qing was in charge of this recruitment competition from the beginning to the end, so it was only right for him to wrap things up. This was the final stage of the recruitment competition. The 10 young geniuses who made it into the top 10 yesterday were about to enter the final battle. It was hard to say who would emerge victorious in the end. Lin Qing immediately announced the start of the competition. Then, according to their number plates, the first round of battles began. There were only 10 people left. These 10 people were the cream of the crop among the hundreds of thousands of people who signed up for the recruitment competition. None of them were weak. However, even so, the strength of each person was quickly revealed. Based on each person's strength, they could be divided into 3 levels. The weakest 4 were obviously at the bottom. The middle 3 were about the same strength. As for the remaining 3, they were obviously stronger than the other 7. These 3 were Xiaoluan, Qin Xian, and Zhang Xian. The 3 of them were obviously not on the same level as the other 7. As such, the final winner would probably be one of the 3. The others had little chance of winning. With Xiao Chen's eyesight, he could naturally see through everyone's strength. However, Nangong Guan, Zhou Song, and Wu Huan, who were sitting beside Xiao Chen, all had faint smiles on their faces. Occasionally, their gazes would fall on Xiaoluan's body. The 3 of them were no strangers to Xiaoluan. She was Xiao Chen's precious daughter. As the battles began and ended, it wasn't long before only Xiaoluan, Qin Xian, and Zhang Xian possessed the qualifications to compete for the first position. Moreover, only the 3 of them still maintained an undefeated record. However, perhaps in order to preserve some suspense, Lin Qing intentionally put the battle between the 3 of them at the end, and decided the rankings from the 4th place onward. It didn't take long for the rankings from the 4th to the 10th to be determined. Only the top 3 remained. Presently, only Xiaoluan's group of 3 had the qualifications to compete for the top 3 rankings. The top 3 battles were the most anticipated. Following Lin Qing's words, the first battle quickly began. Qin Xian versus Zhang Xian. The 2 of them immediately clashed. A young master of the Qin clan against a young master of the Chen clan. The 2 of them already had a grudge against each other. Now that they were fighting in the arena, the smell of gunpowder would naturally fill the air. On the arena, Zhang Xian stood facing each other. He revealed a cold smile and said, "Qin Xian, it has been many years since we last fought, right?" "So what?" Qin Xian's expression was cold when he heard this. "Ha, it's nothing. You're just going to lose to me one more time." Zhang Xian sneered. As his laughter faded, Zhang Xian did not give Qin Xian a chance to reply. His feet moved, and his entire body instantly charged towards Qin Xian. The 2 of them could be said to be old opponents. They understood each other's strength very well. Therefore, they used their full strength from the start. There was no need to test each other's strength. In fact, Qin Xian's strength was not weaker than his own. Therefore, even though Zhang Xian spoke casually, in reality, he did not dare to be careless when facing Qin Xian. He used his full strength from the start. Facing Zhang Xian's attack, Qin Xian reacted immediately. However, for some unknown reason, the 2 of them, who were originally of similar strength, actually fell into a disadvantageous position after the first clash. The difference in strength was not great, and they did not suffer any substantial injuries. However, Qin Xian's condition was clearly inferior to Zhang Xian's. For today's battle, Zhang Xian made preparations and adjusted his condition to the peak. On the other hand, because of Xiaoluan's matter, Qin Xian could be said to have not slept at all last night, let alone meditate to adjust his condition. In terms of condition, Qin Xian's condition was obviously inferior to Zhang Xian's. Zhang Xian naturally sensed it immediately. A trace of a sneer flashed in his eyes as he said coldly, "Qin Xian, it seems like I've won this battle." Qin Xian's condition wasn't at the peak of perfection. As such, Zhang Xian was confident. Their strength had always been on par with each other, so the one who was in a better condition would naturally have a higher chance of winning. At this moment, Qin Xian's condition was obviously inferior to his. Therefore, Zhang Xian naturally believed that victory was in his hands. Upon hearing Zhang Xian's words, Qin Xian didn't respond. Instead, he attacked with a gloomy expression and clashed fiercely with Zhang Xian. Qin Xian ignored Zhang Xian and continued to attack with all his might. However, the difference in condition gradually caused Qin Xian to fall into a disadvantageous position. Qin Xian's second uncle had an ugly expression on his face as he watched the battle unfold on the stage. Anyone with a discerning eye could tell that Qin Xian was clearly showing signs of defeat. Although he was still able to hold on, it was obvious that Zhang Xian had a higher chance of winning if the battle dragged on. Xianer. Seeing that Qin Xian was about to lose, Qin Xian's second uncle was anxious, but there was nothing he could do. This was the sword sect, so naturally, they had to abide by the rules of the sword sect. Even though Qin Xian was about to lose and he was burning with anxiety, Qin Xian's second uncle didn't dare to break the rules of the sword sect. In the fierce battle, Qin Xian found it increasingly difficult to defend against Zhang Xian's ferocious attacks. Zhang Xian had also discovered Qin Xian's weakness. He seized the opportunity and didn't give Qin Xian any time to catch his breath. Under such ferocious attacks, even though Qin Xian had given his all, he gradually felt that he couldn't hold on any longer. Seeing that Qin Xian was about to lose, Zhang Xian's attacks became increasingly ferocious. In the end, Zhang Xian finally caught hold of a flaw in Qin Xian's defense. He fiercely landed a punch on Qin Xian's chest and sent him flying. Qin Xian didn't have the slightest bit of defense against Zhang Xian's punch. He spat out a mouthful of blood. Qin Xian had been severely injured by Zhang Xian's punch. In this case, it was apparent that Qin Xian had lost. However, Zhang Xian wasn't satisfied with this. After Qin Xian was severely injured by him, Zhang Xian once again lunged forward to deliver a fatal blow. In fact, Zhang Xian's attack was meaningless. After all, Qin Xian had already lost. Perhaps Zhang Xian's attack was due to the accumulated resentment between them. Perhaps Zhang Xian's true intention was to use this opportunity to cripple Qin Xian in one fell swoop. The rules stated that one couldn't kill, but there was no way to avoid injuring or crippling someone. Zhang Xian's eyes glinted with a chilling glint. He was ready to cripple Qin Xian in one fell swoop. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 2233. Dense spiritual energy gathered on Zhang Xian's hand. Seeing that Qin Xian was about to be crippled by Zhang Xian, Qin Xian's second uncle abruptly stood up. However, just as he was about to make a move, more than 10 auras locked onto him. There was no doubt that as soon as he made a move, the owners of these 10 auras would instantly restrain him. Dense spiritual energy gathered on Zhang Xian's hand. Seeing that Qin Xian was about to be crippled by Zhang Xian, Qin Xian's second uncle abruptly stood up. However, just as he was about to make a move, more than 10 auras locked onto him. There was no doubt that as soon as he made a move, the owners of these 10 auras would instantly restrain him. The owners of these auras were naturally experts from the sword sect. Although Zhang Xian was about to cripple Qin Xian, the sword sect had its own rules. Qin Xian's second uncle couldn't directly interfere in the competition. Being locked onto by these auras, Qin Xian's second uncle's expression changed. He clenched his teeth. Clearly, he didn't want to see Qin Xian being crippled by Zhang Xian. However, this was the sword sect. He didn't dare to break the rules of the sword sect. Otherwise, the entire Qin family wouldn't be able to bear the wrath of the sword sect. His eyes were filled with anxiety. However, at this moment, a golden ray of light suddenly descended from the sky and protected Qin Xian's body. At the same time, it also easily destroyed Zhang Xian's attack. Someone stepped in to save Qin Xian, and that person was none other than Xiao Chen, who was sitting in the main seat. At the last moment, Xiao Chen had saved Qin Xian. Naturally, no one said anything about Xiao Chen's intervention. Even Zhang Xian didn't dare to show any dissatisfaction. He only glanced at Xiao Chen in confusion. However, it was only a glance. Zhang Xian didn't dare to meet Xiao Chen's gaze. Looking down from above, Xiao Chen slowly said, "The victor has been decided. There's no need to kill. Today is only a competition. It's not the time to settle personal grudges." Xiao Chen had no intention of blaming Zhang Xian. However, upon hearing this, Zhang Xian hurriedly cupped his hands and said, "Sect Master, please forgive me." This junior was too agitated and did not stop in time. It was truly unintentional. It's fine, Xiaochen said indifferently, not caring whether Zhang Xian was telling the truth or not. With Xiaochen's help, the battle ended. Lin Qing immediately announced that Zhang Xian had won. Seeing that Qin Xian was fine, Qin Xian's second uncle secretly sighed in relief. At the same time, he secretly glanced at Qin Xian on the high platform. A strange look flashed across his eyes. No one knew what he was thinking. Qin Xian was helped down the stage. Xiao Wan stepped forward and asked, "How are you? Are you all right?" "It's fine. It's just that I've lost a lot of face," Qin Xian said with a bitter smile. With Xiao Chen's timely help, Qin Xian was naturally fine. Seeing this, Xiao Wan smiled and said, "There's nothing to lose. You aren't in a good state, so you deserve to lose." Xiao Wan spoke very casually with Qin Xian. He wasn't afraid of hurting Qin Xian's feelings. Hearing this, Qin Xian could only shake his head and bitterly smile. His state was indeed inferior to Zhang Xian's. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been defeated so quickly. With Qin Xian's defeat, the only people left who were qualified to fight for first place were Zhang Xian and Xiao Wan. The two of them still had a perfect record, so the first place would naturally come from one of them. Because Zhang Xian had just experienced a great battle, for the sake of fairness, the battle between the two was delayed for 2 hours to give Zhang Xian enough time to recover. At the same time, the sword sect provided Zhang Xian with pills to recover his spirit force and stamina for free. While waiting for Zhang Xian to recover, Xiao Wan didn't seem to be nervous at all. She chatted with Qin Xian from time to time. As for what happened yesterday, the two of them had a tacit understanding not to mention a single word. After thinking about it last night and the crushing defeat from before, Qin Xian had thought it through. Of course, this didn't mean that Qin Xian had chosen to give up on liking Xiao Wan. Instead, he had thought it through and realized that he wasn't worthy of Xiao Wan at all. Xiao Wan was Xiao Chen's daughter, and he was only the young master of the Qin family. With such a status, Qin Xian felt that he wasn't worthy of Xiao Wan. Thus, Qin Xian secretly decided that he would work hard in the future to become truly powerful. Even if he couldn't surpass Xiao Chen, he had to become someone who could protect Xiao Wan. Only then would he be worthy of Xiao Wan. Qin Xian still liked Xiao Wan, but this affection was buried deep in his heart. Before he had enough strength, Qin Xian wouldn't reveal this love. Of course, in the future, Qin Xian would still silently protect Xiao Wan. Only when Qin Xian felt that he had enough strength would he confess to Xiao Wan again. After thinking it through, Qin Xian and Xiao Wan seemed to have returned to the time when they first met. They were much more relaxed when they talked. 2 hours wasn't a long time. Very quickly, Zhang Xian had completely recovered. Lin Qing took the opportunity to announce the start of the next match. Xiao Wan vs Zhang Xian. This was the final match to determine the first place in the recruitment competition. If Zhang Xian could defeat Xiao Wan, then he would undoubtedly be the first place in this recruitment competition. As the two of them walked onto the stage, many of the surrounding sword sect disciples cast unfriendly gazes at Zhang Xian. He could clearly feel the warning in their gazes. It was as if they were saying, "Brat, be careful. If you dare to harm even a single hair on Xiao Wan's head, our senior brothers will teach you a lesson." Most of the senior disciples in the sword sect knew Xiao Wan, so they naturally paid close attention to Xiao Wan's match. Moreover, because Zhang Xian was ruthless when he attacked Qin Xian, they immediately glared at Zhang Xian as a warning. Zhang Xian was puzzled. Why did so many senior disciples suddenly look at him with such hostility? Naturally, Zhang Xian didn't know that it was all because of Xiao Wan. However, under such gazes, Zhang Xian felt very uncomfortable. Forcefully suppressing the nervousness in his heart, Zhang Xian looked at Xiao Wan and revealed a smile. "Beauty, we meet again." Hearing Zhang Xian's words, Xiao Wan didn't reply. On the stage, Nan Gongguan also smiled at Xiao Chen. "Junior brother, this brat has guts. He actually dared to take liberties with Luan Wan." Hearing Nan Gongguan's words, Xiao Chen smiled and said, "It's a waste if one isn't frivolous." This Zhang Xian is a good seedling, but his temperament still needs to be tempered. With his current status, Xiaochen naturally wouldn't bicker with a junior like Zhang Xian. Moreover, Zhang Xian's talent was indeed not bad. At the very least, among the new disciples recruited this time, he was definitely one of the best. The only flaw was Zhang Xian's personality and his narrow-mindedness. However, this wasn't a big problem. With more tempering in the future, it wasn't impossible for him to become a talent. Seeing that Xiaochen didn't show any signs of anger, Nangongguan smiled and didn't say anything else. She turned her head to look at the two people on the stage, waiting for the final result. Begging for your collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. Chapter 2234. Under the watchful eyes of the crowd, Lin Qing announced the start of the competition. Zhang Xian took the initiative to attack. Although Xiao Luan was a woman, and a great beauty at that, Zhang Xian was determined to get first place in this recruitment competition. Under the watchful eyes of the crowd, Lin Qing announced the start of the competition. Zhang Xian took the initiative to attack. Although Xiao Luan was a woman, and a great beauty at that, Zhang Xian was determined to get first place in this recruitment competition. Zhang Xian naturally wouldn't give up so easily if he could obtain first place. Furthermore, Zhang Xian didn't show any mercy and used his full strength. He threw out a punch. Seeing this, Xiao Luan didn't dare to be careless. She drew out her longsword from her spatial ring and slashed out, colliding with Zhang Xian's fist. In a head-on collision, neither of them had the upper hand. Zhang Xian was also surprised by Xiao Luan's strength. She wasn't any weaker than him. Feeling Xiao Luan's strength, Zhang Xian didn't dare to be careless. He drew out his longsword and a dense sword aura revolved around him. Xiao Luan immediately used her sword domain. Sensing Zhang Xian's sword domain, Xiao Luan smiled. Sword domain? I can use it too. As she spoke, Xiao Luan also released her sword domain. Their sword domains overlapped and collided with each other. The sharp sword aura clashed in the air. Their feet moved at the same time and they attacked at almost the same time. Both of their sword techniques were extremely exquisite. It was hard to determine the victor in the fierce battle. As the battle continued, Zhang Xian didn't dare to underestimate Xiao Luan anymore. The pressure was great. Both Xiao Luan and Zhang Xian were under a lot of pressure. Seeing that it was hard to determine the victor, the surrounding sword sect's disciples all looked at Zhang Xian. There were even some disciples who were discussing softly. Senior brother, this brat doesn't know what's good for him. I think we should teach him a lesson. That's right. He doesn't even give face to Luan Luan. He's courting death. There are always some people in this world who don't know what's good for them. Don't worry, once he joins the sword sect, I'll let him know what rules are. The numerous disciples of the sword sect were naturally biased towards Xiao Luan. Moreover, in their opinion, Zhang Xian had already firmly entered the top 3 and was even confirmed to be the second. Yet, he was actually recklessly trying to compete with Xiao Luan for the first position. Wasn't he just looking for trouble? Who was Xiao Luan? She was Xiao Chen's daughter. How could a mere Zhang Xian compete with Xiao Luan for first place? Many of the senior disciples of the sword sect naturally wouldn't agree. From the gazes of the surrounding sword sect disciples, more and more anger and killing intent gathered on Zhang Xian's body. On the other hand, Zhang Xian, who was in an intense battle with Xiao Luan, quickly sensed the extremely dense rage. What's going on? Who did he offend? He couldn't help but be distracted. After some observation, Zhang Xian quickly discovered that the unkind gazes actually came from the senior disciples of the sword sect. At this moment, the senior disciples were looking at him with cold expressions. Aside from anger, their eyes were also filled with warning. Kid, you better be sensible. Otherwise, I'll let you know why the flowers are so red. Many senior disciples narrowed their eyes as they stared at Zhang Xian. The warning in their eyes was self-evident. Toward this, Zhang Xian was truly bewildered. This was supposed to be a proper duel. Just who in the world had he offended? Why are these senior disciples looking at me as if they're looking at an enemy? He had never offended the disciples of the sword sect. What kind of public anger did he cause? While he was puzzled, Xiao Wan's calm voice sounded in Zhang Xian's ears. You dare to be distracted in the middle of a battle? Are you looking down on me? As he spoke, Xiao Wan had already sent out a palm strike. Zhang Xian, who was distracted, simply couldn't react in time and was directly sent flying by Xiao Wan's palm strike. Xiao Wan successfully sent Zhang Xian flying. The surrounding senior disciples immediately clapped their hands and cheered. Some even whistled. Anyone could tell that these senior disciples supported Xiao Wan. Xiao Wan had gained the upper hand, which made these senior disciples extremely excited. However, when Zhang Xian and Xiao Wan were locked in battle again, these senior disciples would coldly stare at Zhang Xian as if they wanted to skin him alive. Just like this, every time Xiao Wan gained the upper hand, the disciples of the sword sect would clap their hands and cheer. Every time Zhang Xian fought fiercely with Xiao Wan and was evenly matched, the disciples of the sword sect would give him another warning look. This made Zhang Xian unable to concentrate on the battle. His heart was constantly in a mess as he was afraid that these senior disciples would be unhappy with him. This kind of battle was simply torture for Zhang Xian. He couldn't use his full strength at all. Therefore, after the two of them exchanged blows for less than 10 minutes, Zhang Xian directly cried out. I admit defeat. I'm not fighting anymore. Zhang Xian could not help but grumble in his heart, what the hell is this? These senior disciples of Swords Gate, are they all crazy? They are all staring at me like a bunch of angry women. How am I supposed to fight now? Zhang Xian took the initiative to admit defeat. In response, the many senior disciples in the first round cheered. They were extremely happy that Xiao Wan had obtained first place. At the same time, their gazes towards Zhang Xian had become much friendlier. There were even some who softly laughed. Not bad, not bad. The child is teachable. Zhang Xian cursed in his heart when he noticed the change in attitude of the senior disciples. What the hell is going on? Is it right for me to admit defeat? Zhang Xian didn't know that in the eyes of the senior disciples, it was indeed right for Zhang Xian to admit defeat. Because no matter how strong you were, since you encountered Xiao Wan, you should take the initiative to admit defeat. After Zhang Xian admitted defeat, the next battle was between Xiao Wan and Qin Xian. Qin Xian originally had time to rest, but when he saw Zhang Xian on the stage, he revealed a bitter smile and said without hesitation, I admit defeat. Qin Xian didn't even enter the stage before admitting defeat. In this way, the first place of the recruitment competition fell to Xiao Wan. Zhang Xian cursed in his heart and jumped off the stage. When he passed by Qin Xian, he said with an unhappy expression, what the hell is going on? I'm first just like that? Zhang Xian still couldn't figure it out. In response, Qin Xian only smiled and didn't say anything. Qin Xian naturally knew the reason behind this. It was also because of Zhang Xian. If he really defeated Xiao Wan, then his future in the sword sect wouldn't be good. The senior disciples definitely wouldn't let him off so easily. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. Chapter 2235. With Zhang Xian's and Qin Xian's victories, Xiao Wan finally won first place in the sword sect's recruitment competition. Many people present were very satisfied with this result. Only Zhang Xian was complaining in his heart. However, Zhang Xian knew that Xiao Wan's strength wasn't weak. Even if it was a fair fight, Zhang Xian didn't have much confidence in winning. Therefore, even if he lost the competition in such a manner, Zhang Xian wasn't too dissatisfied. At most, he felt a little sullen. The 3 rounds of the competition had ended, and the Swords Gate's recruitment had also come to an end. Young cultivators like Zhang Xian, Qin Xian, and the others who had passed the first 2 rounds had all successfully entered the Swords Gate. There were specialized people in charge of the following matters. Xiaochen, Nangong Guan, and the other vice sect masters said a few words of encouragement and quickly left. On the way back to his residence, Xiaochen didn't pay much attention to today's competition. After all, with Xiaochen's current status, he wasn't interested in these children's battles. Even Xiaoluan's final ranking, Xiaochen didn't care much about it. The end of the recruitment competition added a lot of new blood to the Sword Sect. With these people joining the Sword Sect became more lively. At the same time, Xiaoluan also expressed his wish to Xiaochen that night. He wanted to become an outer disciple of the Sword Sect. Xiaoluan wanted to start from the bottom and become an outer disciple. Regarding this, Qin Shuru and the other girls naturally disagreed. However, Xiaochen was very much in favor of this. In the end, Qin Shuru and the other girls couldn't persuade Xiaoluan and could only agree to his request. Just like this, Xiaoluan became an ordinary outer disciple of the Sword Sect. Of course, Xiaoluan's identity was known by many senior disciples in the Sword Sect. Obviously, it was impossible to hide his identity. After becoming an outer court disciple, Xiaoluan's identity was exposed in just 3 days. Knowing that Xiaoluan was actually Xiaochen's daughter, Zhang Xian bitterly smiled. No wonder those old disciples were like that during the competition. However, Xiaoluan didn't do anything special about his identity being exposed. He was still like an ordinary outer disciple. He didn't bully others because of his special identity. The Sword Sect was thriving. At the same time, something big happened in Dragon Palace. After killing Long Yuan, Long Mie successfully took control of the Dragon Palace. Soon, he eliminated the voices of opposition in the Dragon Palace. Seeing that he had finally gained complete control of the Dragon Palace's annihilation, he could not help but feel excited. As the Palace Master of Dragon Palace, Long Mie had been dreaming about this day for a long time. Now, Long Mie truly felt what it meant to be in power. The pleasure that power brought him made him indulge in it and unable to extricate himself. However, this feeling didn't last long. On this day, Tao Ming took Yang Chen to find Long Mie. In Long Mie's cave mansion, Long Mie, who was sitting in the garden, saw Tao Ming take the initiative to come. He smiled and said, "Ancestor, what's the matter?" Tao Ming was now the ancestor of Dragon Palace. However, during this period of time, Tao Ming had been living in seclusion and didn't care about the affairs of Dragon Palace. Therefore, Long Mie had almost forgotten about him. Long Mie was indeed careless, or perhaps foolish. He didn't even have the slightest bit of vigilance against Tao Ming. He had never thought that Tao Ming would attack him. Seeing Tao Ming's arrival, Long Mie was still smiling. Looking at such a foolish Long Mie, Tao Ming also smiled and said, "Palace Master is indeed a genius. I have a whole new level of respect for you since you cleared the Dragon Palace so quickly." "Haha, Ancestor, you are too polite. I have been the Palace Master of Dragon Palace for so many years. If I couldn't even do this, I would be a laughingstock." Hearing this, Long Mie smiled proudly. Tao Ming really admired Long Mie's stupidity from the bottom of his heart. How could a person be so stupid? He was simply a weirdo. Even now that Tao Ming had come personally, Long Mie didn't even realize that something was wrong. Tao Ming also said with a smile, "Indeed. In this case, please give up your position, Palace Master." Tao Ming said bluntly. Only then did Long Mie realize that something was wrong. He looked at Tao Ming with a hint of fear in his eyes and asked coldly, "Ancestor, what do you mean?" "Nothing, but I want to re-establish Heavenly Sect. In this way, the position of Sect Master can only belong to my disciple, Yang Chen." Hearing this, Tao Ming said with a smile, "Re-establish Heavenly Sect?" Even if Long Mie was stupid, he knew what Tao Ming meant. Anger flashed in his eyes and he said coldly, "Tao Ming, don't forget that if it weren't for me, you would have been killed by the Sword Sect. We had an agreement back then." "That's right. But you said it yourself. That was back then. The situation is different now." Tao Ming didn't care about Long Mie's angry shout and smiled slightly. When they were forced to a dead end by the Sword Sect, Long Mie happened to propose an alliance. Tao Ming and Yang Chen agreed after thinking about it. But now, with the fall of Long Yuan, there was no one in Dragon Palace who could keep Tao Ming in check. As a result, the previous agreement naturally had no binding force. What a joke! The so-called agreement required both sides to have similar strength. If one side was too strong or the other side was too weak, the agreement was basically fragile. Just like now, no one in Dragon Palace could keep Tao Ming in check. So, what Tao Ming wanted to do was entirely up to him. Now that Long Mia had completely wiped out Dragon Palace, his role was completely gone. It was normal for Tao Ming to replace him. Hearing Tao Ming's words and seeing Tao Ming walking towards him step by step, Long Mia finally realized the seriousness of the problem. When he joined forces with Tao Ming to kill Long Yuan, it was actually leading the wolf into the house. Now, the wolf finally showed its ferocity. Unfortunately, Long Mia had no means to contend with Tao Ming. Looking at Long Mia's horrified eyes and expression, Tao Ming said faintly, "Learn to be smarter in your next life. That old man Long Yuan is right about one thing. You are indeed too stupid. Remember, any form of cooperation requires a bargaining chip, and now, you have no bargaining chip in your hand." With that, Tao Ming pointed his finger and Long Mia died on the spot. Chapter 2236. Long Mia, who was only at the End Realm, naturally wasn't Tao Ming's match. After Long Mia spent so much effort to stabilize the Dragon Palace, he was destined to die. Long Mia, who was only at the End Realm, naturally wasn't Tao Ming's match. After Long Mia spent so much effort to stabilize the Dragon Palace, he was destined to die. Long Mia didn't even think about it. From the start, Tao Ming never thought about working with him. Everything was just for the Dragon Palace. Now that Long Mia no longer had any value, Tao Ming naturally wouldn't keep him alive. His eyes were filled with unwillingness and regret. But in the end, Long Mia still fell straight down, his aura dissipating. Long Mia died. Looking at his corpse, Yang Chen laughed in disdain. What an idiot. From Yang Chen's point of view, Long Mia was indeed an idiot, a complete idiot. He actually thought that Tao Ming was really cooperating with him. Therefore, from the beginning to the end, he did not take any precautions against Tao Ming, Yang Chen, and the experts of the Heavenly Coiling Sect. People like Long Mia didn't die unjustly. If even an idiot like him wasn't, then there was no justice. Hearing Yang Chen's words, Tao Ming, who was standing by the side, chuckled softly. This guy's death is indeed not to be regretted. It's a pity that the old man, Long Yuan, misjudged him. He actually let such an idiot become the palace master of Dragon Palace and ruin the legacy of Dragon Palace for 10,000 years. As he said that, Tao Ming looked at Yang Chen. His smile grew wider. Chener, I'll leave the rest to you. Don't be like this idiot. Long Mia was already killed. The next step was to control the entire Dragon Palace. Yang Chen said confidently, Master, don't worry. I won't disappoint you. Long Mia was dead. The experts of the Heavenly Sect didn't suffer any casualties in the battle with the Sword Sect. They all followed Tao Ming to the Dragon Palace. Now that he had the help of the experts of the Heavenly Sect, Yang Chen was naturally confident in controlling the Dragon Palace. Moreover, during this period of time, Yang Chen was not idle. He had secretly contacted many high-level members of Dragon Palace. As the saying goes, once a person begins to degenerate, his bottom line will be lowered again and again. These higher-ups of Dragon Palace had betrayed Dragon Abyss before, so it was not impossible for them to accompany Long Mia now. As for the inheritance of the Dragon Palace, was it still important to them? Since they were already traitors, they probably didn't care about the survival of the Dragon Palace. Therefore, under Yang Chen's coercion, more than half of the high-level members of Dragon Palace had already secretly submitted to Tao Ming in Heavenly Sect. As such, with the help of these people and Long Mia's vigorous reforms during this period, it was not difficult for Yang Chen to control the Dragon Palace. On that day, the entire Dragon Palace was once again filled with bloodshed. First, the news of Long Mie's death spread. Then, Yang Chen re-established the heavenly sect, and he was still the sect master. With the Dragon Palace as the foundation, he re-established the heavenly sect. As for the Dragon Palace, it was immediately announced that it had perished. He thought that such a thing would cause many people in the Dragon Palace to oppose, or even try to stop it, but in fact, it was completed smoothly. No one tried to stop them. Or rather, those who tried to stop them were killed by the experts of the heavenly sect in the first place. It was completely natural, and there was almost no resistance. Yang Chen took over the Dragon Palace and re-established the heavenly sect with the Dragon Palace as the foundation. With the establishment of the heavenly sect, the Dragon Palace was obviously declared to be perished. The Dragon Palace, which had stood tall in the Great Thousand World for tens of thousands of years, was destroyed in the hands of a fool. If it were not for Long Mie's jealousy, the heavenly sect would not have destroyed the Dragon Palace, and it was not certain whether Tao Ming and the others were still alive. After all, the Sword Sect would not let the heavenly sect go. Unfortunately, everything was forgotten, and the fool Long Mie had been killed long ago. Tao Ming and Yang Chen's sudden rise in revolt, taking control of the Dragon Palace, and re-establishing the heavenly sect naturally could not be hidden. Soon, the other Lingtian sects in the Great Thousand World also received the news. However, no one was surprised by such an outcome. For example, Dao Ju did not show any shock after hearing about what happened to the Dragon Palace. He only said with some regret. The Dragon Palace, which had stood tall for tens of thousands of years, was destroyed in the hands of a fool. How sad and funny. Dao Ju had guessed Tao Ming's wild ambition from the start. Or rather, other than Long Mie, everyone else could see Tao Ming's wild ambition. After all, this was not a difficult matter. Even if one used their toes to think, they would know that an end-realm cultivator like Tao Ming had no reason to cooperate with him. If it were not for other motives, would Tao Ming have agreed to Long Mie's request? What was laughable was that Long Mie actually thought that Tao Ming only needed to be an old ancestor. Tao Ming was indeed only an old ancestor. However, Tao Ming did not want to be the old ancestor of the Dragon Palace, but the old ancestor of the heavenly sect. The Dragon Palace, which had stood tall in the Great Thousand World for tens of thousands of years, was once glorious and powerful. Just like that, it withdrew from the stage of history in the most humiliating way and was completely destroyed. Dao Ju lamented the destruction of the Dragon Palace. In the Sword Sect, Xiaochen also received the news from the Dragon Palace. Xiaochen was not surprised by this. Like Dao Ju, Xiaochen had already guessed that this would be the end result. How could that fool Long Mie go against Tao Ming and his disciple? Xiaochen sighed softly and lamented, no matter how powerful a sect is, sometimes all it takes is one idiot to bring it to a point of no return. Upon hearing Xiaochen's words, Nangong Guan, Zhou Song, and Wu Huan nodded in agreement. Indeed, the Dragon Palace was strong enough, but because of that fool Long Mie, the Dragon Palace was directly pushed into the abyss of eternal damnation. I wonder what the ancestors of the Dragon Palace would feel if they were in heaven to see it being destroyed in such a humiliating way. Nangong Guan also sighed. The destruction of the Dragon Palace was already a fact, and no one could save it now. The Sword Sect was now faced with how to deal with the re-established heavenly sect. With the enmity between the two sides, if Tao Ming and Yang Chen did not die, they would not let the Sword Sect go. Similarly, Xiaochen and the Sword Sect would not let the heavenly sect go. Therefore, the battle between the two sides was still not over. However, one thing was certain, and that was that there was no fool like Long Mie in the Sword Sect. With a cold look in his eyes, Xiaochen looked at the distant Dragon Palace. Oh no, it should be the direction of the heavenly sect, and said in a cold voice, "Heavenly sect, if I can destroy you once, I can destroy you a second time. This time, I will not give you any chance. Please add, please vote, please recommend." Swordmaster 8 Desolation chapters will continue to be updated in the hand fighting bar. There are no advertisements in the website. Please add and recommend the hand fighting bar. If you like Swordmaster 8 Desolation, please add Swordmaster 8 Desolation. Chapter 2237. The Dragon Palace was taken over by Tao Ming and Yang Chen. Xiao Chen had already expected such an outcome. After all, how could that trash Long Mie suppress Tao Ming and Yang Chen? Now that the Dragon Palace was destroyed and the Hetian sect was established once more, Xiao Chen wasn't too surprised as this was an expected outcome. When Xiao Chen received the news of the Dragon Palace being destroyed, Long Qing, who was also in the Sword Sect, and the two End Realm experts that Xiao Chen brought back also heard the news. After knowing that the Dragon Palace was really destroyed, the three of them were devastated, especially the two End Realm experts. They had been in the Dragon Palace their entire lives, but in the end, they could only watch as it was destroyed and couldn't do anything. They hated Long Mie to the extreme. If it wasn't for him, the Dragon Palace wouldn't have fallen to such a state. It was Long Mie's own stupidity that destroyed the entire Dragon Palace. Long Mie was indeed stupid and his death wasn't regrettable. However, the destruction of the Dragon Palace made the three of them feel bad. After thinking for a long time, Long Qing suddenly said, "Join the Sword Sect. Only the Sword Sect can help us take revenge." The Dragon Palace was already gone. After thinking for a long time, Long Qing decided to join the Sword Sect. Of course, this was mainly for the two of them. After all, with the relationship between Long Qing and Xiao Chen, it didn't make much of a difference whether they joined the Sword Sect or not. As for the two Dragon Palace elders, although they had always been in the Sword Sect, they weren't from the Sword Sect. Xiao Chen only allowed them to stay in the Sword Sect because of Long Qing. Now that the Dragon Palace was destroyed, they, who were once experts of the Dragon Palace, naturally became rootless duckweeds. Moreover, the best way to take revenge was to join the Sword Sect and help the Sword Sect destroy the Hetian sect. This would be considered taking revenge for the Dragon Palace. Hearing Long Qing's words, the two of them were stunned. However, they didn't immediately agree, but they also didn't have much objection. The two of them didn't have much resistance to joining the Sword Sect. However, because they had been part of the Dragon Palace for most of their lives, it was hard for them to suddenly change. Long Qing did not rush the two of them when he saw them fall into silence. He waited quietly at the side. After a long while, the two of them looked at each other and then looked at Long Qing and said, "We'll listen to you." Both of them respected Long Qing very much. After all, Long Qing was the dragon girl of the Dragon Palace. Their loyalty to the Dragon Palace had long been engraved in their bones. Therefore, in their eyes, Long Qing was now their backbone. The two of them agreed to join the Sword Sect, but it still depended on Xiao Chen's opinion. The next day, Long Qing led the three of them to Xiao Chen's residence. Seeing Long Qing, Xiao Chen took the initiative to call out, "Second sister, the destruction of the Dragon Palace must have been a big blow to Long Qing." Xiao Chen wanted to comfort her, but before Xiao Chen could speak, Long Qing smiled and interrupted, "Little brother, don't worry. I'm not that weak. Today, I have something to discuss with you." Hearing Long Qing's words, Xiao Chen swallowed the words at the tip of his tongue. Then, he looked at Long Qing and asked, "Second sister, just say what you want to say." Xiao Chen and Long Qing didn't need to be polite. Hearing this, Long Qing explained the matter briefly. According to Long Qing, the Dragon Palace was still destroyed. The experts of the Dragon Palace who were rescued by Xiao Chen had no home to return to. Therefore, they wanted to join the Sword Sect and become members of the Sword Sect. Hearing Long Qing's words, Xiao Chen naturally wouldn't refuse. The strength of the Sword Sect would definitely be greatly improved if these experts of the Dragon Palace joined the Sword Sect. There was no doubt about this. Moreover, these experts of the Dragon Palace hoped that the Sword Sect would take revenge for the Dragon Palace. However, such a request was nothing to Xiao Chen. This was because even without them, the Sword Sect and Hetian Sect would have a battle sooner or later. Xiao Chen definitely wouldn't let Tao Ming, Yang Chen, and the others off. Without any hesitation, he nodded and agreed. These two End Realm experts of the Dragon Palace directly became the deputy sect masters of the Sword Sect. With two more End Realm experts, the strength of the Sword Sect naturally increased. In the past, the number of End Realm Almighties in Swords sect might not be comparable to the other Ling Tian sects. However, now, the number of End Realm Almighties in Swords sect was no weaker than any of the other Ling Tian sects. Their strength had increased greatly once again. This made Xiaochen extremely happy. Everyone of the Dragon Palace joined the Sword sect, causing the strength of the Sword sect to increase greatly. In the following period of time, the Hetian sect didn't do anything special. The Sword sect temporarily didn't have the time to deal with the Hetian sect. In addition, the other Ling Tian sects also stopped fighting. For a time, the vast Thousand Worlds seemed to have returned to peace. Under such peace, Xiaochen cultivated diligently every day. Half a year passed in the blink of an eye. Within this half a year, Xiaochen's cultivation naturally broke through to the small perfection Dao realm. After breaking through, Xiaochen's strength obviously increased again. However, what made Xiaochen the happiest wasn't the increase in his cultivation, but the fact that Qin Shuru and Baihua Fairy were both pregnant. That's right, the fact that the two women were pregnant at the same time was the happiest thing for Xiaochen's family. Every day, other than cultivating and dealing with some Sword sect affairs, Xiaochen accompanied the women, especially Qin Shuru and Baihua Fairy, who were now the treasures of the entire Xiao family. Bai Riyue stayed by Qin Shuru and Baihua Fairy's side almost all day long. After a day of cultivation, Xiaochen, Qin Shuru, and Baihua Fairy sat in the pavilion in the courtyard. Looking at the two women's gradually bulging bellies, Xiaochen couldn't help but smile. "What are you smiling about?" Baihua Fairy rolled her eyes at Xiaochen when she saw him smiling foolishly. Hearing Baihua Fairy's words, Xiaochen smiled and replied, "I'm just happy that the two of you have done well." Although Xiaochen already had a daughter, Xiaoluan's identity was very special. She was the world spirit of the Eight Desolates world and wasn't Xiaochen's biological child. Now, Qin Shuru and Baihua Fairy's children were his own. However, Xiaochen didn't look down on Xiaoluan just because his children were about to be born. After so many years of being by her side, Xiaochen had long treated Xiaoluan as his own daughter. At the same time, Xiaoluan was also very curious about her brother and sister who were about to be born. At the same time, she was also looking forward to it. Recently, whenever she had time, Xiaoluan would run back and say that she wanted to see her unborn brother and sister. Chapter 2238. Just as Xiaochen and the girls were chatting in the courtyard, Xiaoluan rushed in. Xiaochen could not help but smile bitterly at the sight of the little girl rushing into the courtyard. Just as Xiaochen and the girls were chatting in the courtyard, Xiaoluan rushed in. Xiaochen could not help but smile bitterly at the sight of the little girl rushing into the courtyard. In the past, although Xiaoluan was mischievous at home, at least Qin Shuru and the others were there to take care of her. Now, after entering the outer sect, she was free to do whatever she wanted. This little girl was getting wilder and wilder. Sure enough, looking at Xiaoluan's energetic appearance, 100 Flower Fairy said with a smile, "Girl, why are you so impetuous?" "Second mother, let me hear it." Xiaoluan didn't care about 100 Flower Fairy's teasing. She pounced on 100 Flower Fairy's body and pressed her ear against 100 Flower Fairy's belly. Not only 100 Flower Fairy, but Qin Shuru, Tianyu, Guling Yao, and Hongxiu also laughed when they saw Xiaoluan's behavior. Just like Xiaochen, the girls didn't neglect Xiaoluan even though Qin Shuru and 100 Flower Fairy were pregnant. They still treated her like their own daughter. Xiaoluan obviously felt this as well. Therefore, she didn't feel any jealousy towards her little brother and sister who were about to be born. Even with Xiaoluan's carefree personality, she was looking forward to the birth of her little brother and sister. Because of this, she would have 2 little followers in the future. Xiaoluan didn't feel any jealousy or worry. This was what Xiaochen was happy to see. Xiaochen didn't want the arrival of these 2 little guys to cause any misunderstandings in Xiaoluan's heart or create any estrangement between them. After watching Xiaoluan fool around for a while, Xiaochen said, "Luan, how have you been recently? Did you cause any trouble?" Xiaoluan didn't have any special status in the outer sect. Just like the other outer sect disciples, Xiaolan needed to cultivate and complete missions. At the same time, she also needed to participate in all the outer sect assessments. She wouldn't have any special treatment just because she was his daughter. This was also something that Xiaochen had specifically instructed him to do. Hearing Xiaochen's words, Xiaolan threw herself into Xiaochen's arms and said coquettishly, "What trouble can I cause? Moreover, I'm first place in the outer court competition." Every once in a while, the outer court would hold a competition to test the progress of the outer court disciples during this period. Of course, Xiaochen rarely paid attention to this. It was all handled by the deacons of the outer court. When he heard that Xiaolan had won first place in the outer sect competition, Xiaochen laughed and scolded her, "You little girl, I don't even need to think to know that you won first place in the outer sect because everyone let you win, right? Who said so? I really won first place with my own strength. If you don't believe me, father, you can ask the deacon of the outer court." Xiaolan refused to let it go. In fact, Xiaochen was very clear about Xiaolan's strength. With her extremely high cultivation talent, Xiaolan only needed to put in a little effort to achieve unimaginable progress. This was the difference. Moreover, with Xiaolan's strength, she was indeed one of the best in the outer court. She liked it when Xiaochen praised her. Thus, she couldn't resist Xiaolan's coaxing and pestering. In the end, Xiaochen smiled and said, "Okay, okay, okay. My Wan is the best, okay?" Every time Xiaochen performed, Xiaolan would be very happy. When the family was together, they seemed to be very happy. This was what Xiaochen had been looking for all along. After struggling in the Great Thousand World for so many years, Xiaochen could finally say that he had the ability to protect his family. Time passed day by day, and in the blink of an eye, a few months had passed. As time passed, Qin Shuru and 100 Flower Fairies' bellies grew bigger and bigger. Soon, it was time for them to give birth. Strangely enough, Qin Shuru and 100 Flower Fairy were pregnant almost at the same time. Now, they were giving birth at the same time. On this day, in Xiaochen's cave residence, Xiaochen, Long Qing, Nangong Guan, Zhou Song, Wu Huan, and the other higher-ups of the Sword sect gathered together. In the courtyard, Xiaochen was nervously pacing back and forth. The reason why Xiaochen was so nervous was naturally because Qin Shuru and 100 Flower Fairy were giving birth. He couldn't help but worry. Seeing Xiaochen like this, Nangong Guan smiled and said, "Junior brother, you've been pacing back and forth for almost an hour. Don't worry, it'll be fine." Qin Shuru and 100 Flower Fairy were both martial artists. Logically speaking, they shouldn't be in any danger. After all, martial artists' physiques were far superior to ordinary people. There shouldn't be any difficulties in giving birth and dying. But even though he knew this, Xiaochen couldn't help but worry. Perhaps this was how a husband and father felt. Hearing Nangong Guan's words, Xiaochen smiled bitterly and said, "Senior brother, Sigh, how can I not worry? It's been almost 4 hours. It had indeed been almost 4 hours since Qin Shuru and 100 Flower Fairy had started giving birth. How could Xiaochen not worry?" Hearing Xiaochen's words, Nangong Guan smiled bitterly and didn't say anything. As a father, Nangong Guan naturally understood Xiaochen's feelings. Xiaochen had never felt that time was passing so slowly. Every minute and every second felt like torture to him. Just as Xiaochen was getting more and more anxious, the sound of a child crying suddenly came from the room. Hearing this sound, Xiaochen's face lit up and he hurriedly strode into the room. Inside the room, Qin Shuru and 100 Flower Fairies' faces were somewhat pale. However, they didn't seem to be in any danger. Beside them, Qing Yao, Qing Luo, Fei Mei, and Enlan were also sweating profusely. Fortunately, both mother and child were safe in the end. Seeing Xiaochen enter the room, Qing Yao and Qing Luo carried the 2 crying babies to Xiaochen and said with a smile, "Young master, it's 2 fat boys." After following Xiaochen for so many years, Qing Yao and Qing Luo clearly weren't that restrained. Normally, they would speak very casually with Xiaochen. Hearing their words, Xiaochen was also very happy. He hugged the two chubby boys in his arms and looked at the two children in his arms. These were Xiaochen's sons. Strangely enough, the two boys were originally crying non-stop. However, after being hugged by Xiaochen, they quickly stopped crying. Moreover, their big eyes were curiously sizing up Xiaochen. It was as if they were saying, "Is this guy daddy?" Being sized up by the two boys, Xiaochen was overjoyed. He laughed heartily and carried them to Qin Shuru and 100 Flower Fairy's side. Looking at their children, Qin Shuru and 100 Flower Fairy both revealed benevolent expressions. This was the instinct of a mother. Even Qin Shuru, who always gave people a cold feeling, appeared extremely gentle at this moment. Chapter 2239. Looking at the two chubby boys lying beside Qin Shuru and Fairy of 100 Flowers, Xiaochen couldn't help but smile. However, Qin Shuru and Fairy of 100 Flowers also needed to rest, so Xiaochen didn't stay for too long. After comforting the two girls, he quickly left the room. After all, Qin Yao, Tian Yu, Guling Yao, and Hong Xiu were taking care of him. There was no need for Xiaochen here. When Xiaochen returned to the courtyard, Nangong Guan and the others, as well as Long Qing, all smiled and said, "Congratulations, Sect Master, for having a son." Qin Shuru and Fairy of 100 Flowers had both given birth to two chubby boys for him. This made Xiaochen very happy, so when he heard everyone's congratulations, Xiaochen laughed heartily. After laughing, Xiaochen directly invited everyone to drink to their heart's content. When they arrived at another courtyard in the cave residence, everyone sat together, drinking and chatting. As they chatted, Long Qing looked at Xiaochen and said, "Little brother, have you thought of names?" Of course, Xiaochen had already thought of names for the two chubby boys of Qin Shuru and Fairy of 100 Flowers. In response to Long Qing's question, Xiaochen smiled faintly and said, "Let's call them Xiao Yao and Xiao Lao." The older one would be called Xiao Yao, while the younger one would be called Xiao Lao. Hearing this, Long Qing nodded slightly. Then, Xiaochen smiled mysteriously at Long Qing. "Second sister, I plan to have these two boys become apprentices to you and big brother. What do you think?" Long Qing and Xianyuan Ling were Xiaochen's sworn siblings. Logically speaking, the two of them were Xiao Yao and Xiao Lao's godfather and godmother. However, Xiaochen had the intention to have the two boys become apprentices to the two of them. Long Qing didn't object to this and readily nodded in agreement. Thus, Xiaochen decided to have Xiao Lao become Long Qing's apprentice and Xiao Yao become Xianyuan Ling's apprentice. However, Xianyuan Ling wasn't in the sword sect right now, so they could only wait for him to return. Xiaochen was overjoyed at the birth of his children. Everyone drank to their heart's content. Until the next day. The birth of Xiao Yao and Xiao Luo, to the entire Sword's Gate, was a joyous occasion. And these two little guys, to put it bluntly, they were indeed born with a golden spoon in their mouths. From the moment they were born, they were destined to have a noble status. As their father, Xiaochen gave these two boys a perfect family and background. At least in the Great Thousand World, Xiao Yao and Xiao Lao could be said to be the top princes. Thinking about it, how many people in the Great Thousand World could be compared to the princes of the Sword Sect? These two boys were indeed very fortunate. Not only did their family background defy the heavens, but Xiaochen's family also doted on these two boys. This was especially so for the two elders, Xiaoqing and Bai Ruyue. They were afraid that they would melt in their mouths and fall out of their hands. In addition, Guling Yao, Tian Yu, and Hong Xiu also treated these two boys as their own. After so many years of getting along, the relationship between these girls had long been like that of sisters. Therefore, Qin Shuru and Fairy of 100 Flowers' children naturally treated them like their own children. They were doted on by everyone. This was the result of their father, Xiaochen's hard work. With the company of his sons and the Great Thousand Worlds' temporary peace, Xiaochen naturally enjoyed a few rare years of familial happiness. The matters of the sword sect developed in an orderly manner. The system of martial arts academies in the Sword Mansion was also gradually established. 5 years passed in the blink of an eye. At this time, within the Sword Mansion, almost every city had a martial arts academy. These martial arts academies would recruit a batch of students every year. There was no need for expensive tuition fees. In fact, even ordinary people could afford it. Of course, these martial arts academies only taught the basics of cultivation. However, even so, it was enough to make many ordinary people who had no cultivation extremely excited. At the very least, they now had the possibility of stepping into the martial path and becoming a martial artist. Xiao Chen's dream was for everyone to be able to cultivate. He didn't ask for their cultivation to be high, but at least they could prolong their lives and strengthen their bodies. After 5 years of hard work, this goal seemed to be slowly being achieved, at least within the Sword Mansion. Moreover, in these 5 years, Xiao Yao and Xiao Luo had also slowly grown up. Although they were not yet at the age of cultivation, because they had all kinds of spiritual treasures of heaven and earth to strengthen their bodies since they were young, the physical quality of these two boys was already very good. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that Xiao Yao and Xiao Lao's starting point was much higher than that of their father, Xiao Chen. Almost from a young age, they started to enjoy the best cultivation environment and various treasures of heaven and earth. As for Xiao Chen, in these 5 years, Xiao Chen naturally wouldn't be idle. His cultivation had already reached the peak of the Dao realm. A month ago, Xiao Chen also started to go into seclusion to try to break through to the end realm. Xiao Chen going into seclusion to try to break through to the end realm was a huge matter for the Sword Sect. Moreover, in these 5 years of peace, the sect leaders of the 10 Lingtian sects like Xiao Xiao, Dao Ju, and Yang Chen were all on the verge of breaking through to the end realm. Today, all the geniuses were about to break through to the end realm. At such a time, if anyone failed to break through to the end realm, they would be pulled apart by others. This was why the Sword Sect paid a lot of attention to Xiao Chen's breakthrough. After all, there was a huge difference between the end realm and the Dao realm. Although Xiao Chen and the other geniuses were strong enough to fight against end realm experts at the Dao realm, it was still impossible for them to fight against end realm experts. However, since they were all geniuses, it was obviously impossible for them to fight opponents who were of a higher cultivation level than them. Once they failed to break through, it would mean that the gap between them and their opponents would be widened. A month passed and Xiao Chen still didn't make any moves. As for the Shrine's Hall leader, Shen Hui, it was said that he had successfully broken through to the end realm a day ago, becoming the first person to break through to the end realm out of all the geniuses. Since Shen Hui had already broken through, Nangong Guan and the others naturally became more and more anxious. They all hoped that Xiao Chen could successfully break through. On this day, in Xiao Chen's cave, Qin Shiru and the other girls sat together. Xiao Yao and Xiao Lao were playing at the side. Looking at the two kids, Qin Shiru said worriedly, "It has already been a month. I wonder how my husband is doing." Xiao Chen had already been in seclusion for a month, but there was still no news from him. Hearing this, 100 Flower Fairy was also worried. However, at this moment, an aura suddenly surged into the sky from the secret room where Xiao Chen was in seclusion. The appearance of this aura was quickly sensed by the experts of the Sword Sect. Nangong Guan, Zhou Song, Wu Huan, and the other Vice Sect Masters' cave dwellings all had joyous expressions on their faces as they excitedly said, "The Sect Master broke through." Chapter 2240. Sensing the aura coming from Xiao Chen's cave, Nangong Guan and the other Vice Sect leaders were all extremely excited. This aura clearly indicated that he had stepped into the end realm. In other words, Xiao Chen had successfully broken through to the end realm. Sensing the aura coming from Xiao Chen's cave, Nangong Guan and the other Vice Sect leaders were all extremely excited. This aura clearly indicated that he had stepped into the end realm. In other words, Xiao Chen had successfully broken through to the end realm. Xiao Chen's success in breaking through to the end realm allowed Nangong Guan and the other Vice Sect leaders' hearts to finally drop. After all, after Shen Hui's breakthrough, they were really worried that Xiao Chen would fail. If that happened, the impact on the sword sect would be too great. Luckily, Xiaochen didn't disappoint them and successfully broke through to the End Realm. They hurried over to Xiaochen's cave. Outside the secret room where Xiaochen was cultivating, Nangong Guan and the others, as well as Qin Shuru, 100 Flower Fairy, Xiao Yao, and Xiao Lao, were all anxiously waiting. Xiao Yao and Xiao Lao hadn't started cultivating yet, but they could feel the terrifying aura coming from the secret room. Being held in the arms of Qin Shuru and 100 Flower Fairy, Xiao Yao said in a daze. "Mom, is Dad inside?" "Dad will come out soon." Hearing this, Qin Shuru smiled. Ever since Xiao Yao was born, Qin Shuru wasn't as cold as before. Especially when facing his son, he was like a loving mother. Under everyone's waiting, the door to the secret room was opened, and Xiaochen slowly walked out. Because he had just broken through, he wasn't able to control his aura very well. However, when they saw Xiaochen, Nangong Guan and the others all revealed a relieved smile. Seeing that everyone was present, Xiaochen smiled and said, "I did not disappoint you." After successfully breaking through to End Realm, Xiaochen heaved a sigh of relief. At the same time, when they saw Xiaochen, Xiao Yao and Xiao Lao broke free from their mother's embrace and walked in front of Xiaochen, wanting Xiaochen to hug them. The two brothers, who were already 5 years old, were extremely dependent on Xiaochen. Seeing this, Xiaochen smiled and hugged the two brothers at the same time. Xiaochen's breakthrough allowed the sword sect to heave a sigh of relief. At the same time, it also made the other prodigies who had yet to break through feel pressured. Now, out of all the geniuses and monsters, Shenhui and Xiaochen had successfully broken through to the End Realm. Next, it was up to the others. In the next month, Xiaochen had been consolidating his cultivation realm. During this month, Dao Ju, Li Chun, Xiao Xiao, Yang Chen, and Yinxing all broke through to the End Realm. The various prodigies had all stepped into the End Realm. This also meant that they were truly standing at the top of the Great Thousand World. With the cultivation realms of these geniuses, as long as the sovereigns didn't appear, no one would be able to threaten them. Similarly, End Realm experts wouldn't be a match for these geniuses. A month passed in the blink of an eye. Xiaochen had also completely stabilized his cultivation realm. However, it wasn't peaceful for long. Very quickly, something big happened in the 10,000 Weapon Manor. It was said that an ancient relic had appeared, and it had already attracted many cultivators from the Great Thousand World. Originally, Xiaochen didn't pay much attention to the appearance of an ancient relic in the 10,000 Weapon Manor. He could just casually send an expert from the sword sect over. However, according to the news that was sent back, the ancient relic that appeared in the 10,000 Weapon Manor had reincarnation energy drifting out. Based on speculation, it should be related to the Reincarnation Emperor. Since it was related to the Reincarnation Emperor, Xiaochen immediately thought of Xian Yuanling. Xian Yuanling had left for many years, and there had been no news of him. What Xian Yuanling had told Xiaochen back then was to head to the Reincarnation Emperor's place of inheritance and obtain the complete inheritance of the Reincarnation Emperor. Now, the ancient relic that appeared in the 10,000 Weapon Manor had reincarnation energy drifting out. It was very likely related to Xian Yuanling. Since it was related to Xian Yuanling, Xiaochen naturally couldn't ignore it. Moreover, it was said that the Heavenly Yin Tower also attached great importance to the ancient relic and had already sent many experts over. In the main hall, Xiaochen sat on the main seat, and below him, Sangxing told Xiaochen all the news that he had received. After hearing Sangxing's words, Xiaochen muttered softly, "I'm afraid that Big Brother is now in the ancient relic." All the signs indicated that Xian Yuanling was most likely in the ancient relic, and this ancient relic should be the place where the Reincarnation Emperor had fallen. With this thought, Xiaochen decided to head over personally. After all the major forces were very interested in the ancient relic, and the 10,000 Weapon Manor was the territory of the Heavenly Yin Tower. Xiaochen was worried that Xian Yuanling would be in danger, so he naturally couldn't sit back and do nothing. Seeing that Xiaochen had decided to head over personally, Sangxing was slightly taken aback. "Sect Master, are you going over personally? Why don't you let me go?" In Song Xing's opinion, this matter didn't require Xiaochen to head over personally. However, Xiaochen directly shook his head and refused. This matter concerns Big Brother's safety, so I have to head over personally. Moreover, the Heavenly Yin Tower doesn't have a good relationship with my sword sect. I'm afraid that they will suddenly attack. If the ancient relic appeared in the territory of the Moon Palace or the Saber sect, Xiaochen might not be so nervous. However, since it appeared in the territory of the 10,000 Weapon Manor, Xiaochen had no choice but to make sufficient preparations. After all, the relationship between the Heavenly Yin Tower and the Sword sect wasn't friendly. In the past few years, both sides had broken out several small-scale conflicts, but they were all left unsettled in the end. The Heavenly Yin Tower had no choice but to guard against them. Moreover, Xiaochen understood Yin Xing's methods of doing things very well. Just like his master, Yin Lit Yin, they would do anything to achieve their goals. Xiaochen was determined to personally head over to the 10,000 Weapon Manor. Song Xing didn't say anything about this. After all, Xiaochen was the sect master. If he wanted to do something, Song Xing naturally couldn't stop him. After deciding to personally head over to the 10,000 Weapon Manor, Xiaochen returned home and told Qin Shuru and the other girls about this matter. Qin Shuru and the other girls didn't stop Xiaochen, but they repeatedly reminded him to be careful. After bidding farewell to his family, Xiaochen brought Lin Qing, Song Xing, Li Ku, the 3 deputy sect masters, and the 10 sword leaders to the 10,000 Weapon Manor early the next morning. There weren't many people, but all of them were experts from the sword sect. Actually, Xiaochen was not very interested in the treasures in the ancient ruins during this trip to the 1,000 Weapon residence. After all, with the current strength of the Sword's Gate, ordinary treasures were no longer of interest to them. Xiaochen's only goal was to ensure Xian Yuanling's safety. As for other things, Xiaochen didn't think too much about it. They rushed all the way to the 10,000 Weapon Manor. Because the 10,000 Weapon Manor and the Sword sect were neighbors, Xiaochen and the rest entered the 10,000 Weapon Manor in a short time. Sect Master, I heard that the shrines have also sent people over. Moreover, it seems like 2 deputy palace masters are personally leading the team. After entering the 10,000 Weapon Manor, Song Xing received a sound transmission talisman. He immediately reported the contents of the sound transmission talisman to Xiaochen. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. Chapter 2241. The shrines had also sent someone over. Upon hearing this, Xiaochen nodded slightly but did not say much. The group continued on their way. In the next 2 hours, Song Xing received several voice transmission talismans. According to the contents of the voice transmission talismans, Song Xing also told Xiaochen that in addition to the shrines, the Moon Palace, Saber sect, and even the Heavenly sect had sent people over to the 10,000 Weapon Mansion. Other than the Dan Valley and the Heavenly Policy Mansion, the rest of the 10 Great Ling Tian sects had basically sent people over. It seemed like everyone valued this ancient relic very much. However, thinking about it, the Reincarnation Emperor was at least in the top 5 in the history of the Great Thousand World. He was one of the most powerful emperors. As for the relic that he had left behind, there must be a lot of treasures. Moreover, the most important thing was that the Reincarnation Emperor had originally comprehended the reincarnation doctrine. This was also the reason why everyone valued this relic so much. Very few people could comprehend the mysteries of the reincarnation doctrine. Not only the 10 Great Ling Tian sects, but the other great sects had also sent people over to see if they could take advantage of the situation. Xiaochen was not in the mood to pay attention to this. Anyway, Xiaochen had personally come this time for Xian Yuanling. He was worried that Xian Yuanling would be in danger, so Xiaochen had specially rushed over. As for the treasures in the relic, Xiaochen did not care and had no intention of fighting for them. Of course, with Xian Yuanling's character, if he was in the relic, he would have already obtained the treasures. Therefore, Xiaochen did not need to fight for anything at all. According to the news that was sent back, the relic had not truly opened yet. It was estimated that they would only be able to enter after a period of time. Therefore, after entering the 10,000 weapon mansion, Xiao Chen and the rest were not in a hurry. This was because even if they arrived at the relic, Xiao Chen would not be able to enter at this time. As for forcing their way in, it was not impossible. As long as an emperor took action, they would definitely be able to forcefully break the restrictions around the ancient relic. However, in doing so, it was very likely that the ancient relic would be destroyed. After all, under normal circumstances, the restrictions around the ancient relic could not be forcefully broken. Otherwise, the relic would likely self-destruct. At that time, the gains would not make up for the losses. There was no hurry. As long as the relic had not completely opened, Xian Yuan Ling. Along the way, Xiao Chen and the rests. After all, he was the sword sex. If his identity was exposed in the Heavenly Yin Tower, there would be a lot of trouble. After all, he was not exposed his identity. He was. After all, if he was exposed. Of course, Xiao Chen was not afraid that Yin Sheng would attack him. Unless Yin Sheng was absolutely sure that he could kill Xiao Chen, Yin Sheng would not attack Xiao Chen so easily. It was just that the Heavenly Yin Tower and the Sword Sect were evenly matched. It was almost impossible for Yin Sheng to have full confidence in killing him. Therefore, Xiao Chen was not afraid of Yin Sheng. They arrived at the closest city to the Reincarnation Emperor's relic. It was called Jinlun City. The city was not big. In the Great Thousand World, cities of this size could be said to be everywhere. Jinlun City was not very famous. However, this time, with the relic of the Reincarnation Emperor, the small Jinlun City became lively. People from all the major forces gathered in Jinlun City. With so many forces coming from Jinlun City and gathering in one place, it naturally made Jinlun City extremely chaotic. They directly entered the city. In the city, the Sword Sect had already prepared a residence for Xiao Chen. At a glance, Jinlun City was simply overcrowded. Not only were people from the major forces, but many independent cultivators had also rushed to Jinlun City. They wanted to see if they could pick up some scraps. The city governor's office of Jinlun City naturally could not do anything about it. As a small city, the city governor's office naturally could not control all the major forces. Not to mention Ling Tian's sect like the Sword Sect, any major force was not something the city governor's office of Jinlun City could contend with. At this time, the city governor's office of Jinlun City could only rely on the Heavenly Yin Tower. However, the news had already been sent to the Heavenly Yin Tower, but the experts of the Heavenly Yin Tower had not arrived. They did not intend to cause trouble. However, sometimes, trouble would provoke you even if you did not want to. They walked all the way to the residential area that had already been prepared. Due to the crowd on the road, Xiao Chen and the others bumped into several disciples of the temple. As disciples of the shrines, these people were naturally used to being arrogant. At this time, when they met Xiao Chen, they had no intention of giving way. Moreover, they were cursing. "Get lost. Can't you see that we are from the shrines?" In the Great Thousand World, there were not many forces that dared to provoke the shrines. Moreover, Xiao Chen's group was not wearing the Sword Sect's uniform. Therefore, these disciples of the shrines were naturally fearless. Hearing this, Xiao Chen frowned slightly and said indifferently, "Slap them." Following Xiao Chen's words, a sword body of the Sword Sect respectfully responded. Then, in a flash, he disappeared from his original position. Subsequently, a crisp sound of slapping was heard. Several disciples of the Sacred Hall were sent flying with a single slap from the head swordsman. After that, Xiao Chen did not even bother to look at those people and walked away. Xiao Chen naturally did not care about a few disciples of the shrines. Not to mention that they were only disciples of the shrines. Even if the deputy hall master of the shrines came, Xiao Chen would not care about them. In the Sage Palace, the only one who could stand on equal footing with Xiao Chen was Shen Hui. Others were afraid of the shrines, but it did not mean that the Sword Sect would be afraid of them. Moreover, Xiao Chen was the sect master of the Sword Sect. How could these insignificant disciples casually insult him? However, when they saw Xiao Chen's group send the disciples of the shrines flying with a slap and then leave, the people around them shook their heads and said, "Do these people not know the identity of the shrines? I think so. Otherwise, they would definitely not dare to make a move." They even dared to hit the disciples of the shrines. Everyone thought that Xiao Chen and his group were dead meat. After all, what was the shrines? They were one of the 10 great Ling Tian sects. The people around them discussed. At the same time, the few disciples of the shrines who were sent flying previously stood up shakily. The leader covered his face and said with rage in his eyes, "You're courting death. Follow them. I'll go back and look for the elders." The sword body who attacked earlier was obviously of the Dao realm cultivation base. His strength was far stronger than these few disciples. However, so what? He was merely a Dao realm expert. If the shrines wanted to kill him, it would be as easy as killing an ant. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. Chapter 2242. One of the disciples secretly followed Xiao Chen's group, while the others returned to ask the shrine's elders for help. One of the disciples secretly followed Xiao Chen's group, while the others returned to ask the shrine's elders for help. As disciples of the shrines, these people were naturally proud and arrogant. They were used to being arrogant. After all, with the strength of the shrines, who would dare to attack them? Along the way, Zhang Xing whispered to Xiao Chen, who was beside him, "Lord, do you need me to deal with this?" Zhang Xing could easily sense that a disciple of the shrines was following them. However, Xiao Chen smiled and shook his head. No need. To be honest, Xiao Chen was not interested in these disciples of the shrines at all because they were too weak. He could not be bothered with them at all. However, this disciple of the shrines did not know about this at all. He was following Xiao Chen's group, thinking that he was well hidden. They arrived at the residence that had been prepared in advance. It was a courtyard that was not too big. Xiao Chen did not care much about it. After all, he could not stay in Jinluan City for too long. After confirming where Xiao Chen and the others were staying, the disciple of the shrines quickly turned back. At the same time, in the courtyard where the shrines were staying, several disciples were standing respectfully in front of 2 deputy hallmasters of the shrines. On this trip to Jinluan City, 2 deputy hallmasters of the shrines led the team. However, as the hallmaster, Shen Hui did not come in person. They exaggerated the previous incident. In any case, from the words of these disciples, Xiao Chen's group was simply heinous and did not take the shrines seriously at all. After hearing these words, one of the deputy hallmasters said with a gloomy face, "They are courting death. I want to see who dares to not take the shrines seriously." One of the deputy palace masters seemed a little angry, but the other said, "Look at the big picture. Don't cause trouble." Everyone had come here for the ancient ruins. There was no benefit in stirring up trouble for no reason. One of the 2 deputy palace masters was prepared to teach Xiao Chen and the others a lesson, while the other felt that it was better to avoid trouble and not lose the big picture for a small matter. Hearing the advice of the deputy shrines, who was about to teach Xiao Chen and his group a lesson, said with a sullen face, "A bunch of random people dare to disrespect us shrines. If we don't teach them a lesson, how can we shrines have any face left? Don't worry, nothing will happen." He didn't listen to his companion's advice at all. Perhaps in the eyes of this deputy palace master, teaching Xiao Chen and his group a lesson was simply a trivial matter. It wasn't worth worrying about at all. Because of this person's character, the other deputy palace master didn't say anything more after thinking about it. Although he didn't want to cause trouble, with the strength of the shrines, it was not a problem to teach a bunch of random people a lesson. Therefore, the deputy palace master didn't say anything more and chose to acquiesce. Seeing this, the hot-tempered deputy palace master immediately stood up and said to the disciples in front of him, "Let's go. Take me there. I want to see who dares to disrespect us shrines." After saying that, the group directly left the residence and went straight to the courtyard where Xiao Chen and the others were. In the courtyard, Xiao Chen, Sang Xing and the others were sitting together. There wasn't the slightest trace of worry on their faces. At the same time, the courtyard door was directly kicked open. Then, the deputy palace master of the shrine strode in with the disciples from before. They were extremely arrogant and didn't put Xiao Chen and the others in their eyes. Looking at the few people striding in, a cold light flashed in Xiao Chen's eyes. However, before Xiao Chen could speak, Sang Xing and Lin Qing stood up and took a step forward. Their figures instantly blocked the path of the shrines. The originally angry deputy palace master of the shrines was clearly stunned when he saw Sang Xing and Lin Qing. From his expression, he seemed to have recognized Sang Xing and Lin Qing. As the deputy palace master of the shrines, he naturally recognized Sang Xing and Lin Qing. After all, the two of them were the deputy sect masters of the sword sect. It would be strange if he didn't recognize them. Facing the deputy palace master of the shrines being stunned, Sang Xing sneered and said, What do you shrines mean by this? They were both End Realm experts and there wasn't any difference in status. Sang Xing naturally wouldn't be afraid of this deputy palace master of the shrines. Hearing Sang Xing's words, the deputy palace master of the shrines also fiercely glared at the disciples behind him. It was obvious that he was blaming them. Didn't they say that they were a bunch of mobs? How could they be from the sword sect? In the past, the shrines might have been able to look down on the sword sect. However, the current sword sect wasn't something that the shrines dared to look down on. Even the heavenly sect was destroyed by the sword sect. If it wasn't for the survival of the Dragon Palace, how could the heavenly sect still exist in this world? The sword sect had the confidence to not fear the shrines. However, since they were already here, for the sake of the shrine's face, they naturally couldn't leave with their tails between their legs. Thus, the deputy palace master of the shrines also said in a deep voice, Isn't the sword sect going too far? What's the meaning of beating up our shrine's disciples for no reason? For the sake of the shrine's face, they naturally couldn't leave with their tails between their legs. However, hearing this, Sang Xing coldly looked at the disciples of the shrines and said indifferently, It seems like you guys aren't telling the truth. Do you know the consequences of doing so? They didn't expect Xiao Chen's group to be from the sword sect. Moreover, Sang Xing and Lin Qing were both deputy sect masters of the sword sect. At this moment, hearing Sang Xing's words, the disciples' faces became incomparably ugly. They naturally knew the consequences of doing so. If this caused a conflict between the two sides, the consequences were far from what they could bear. Hearing Sang Xing's words, the deputy sect master of the shrines wasn't stupid. He quickly realized that something was wrong. It was obvious that the truth was somewhat different from what the disciples beside him had said. He cursed in his heart, but now it was too late to back down. However, what the deputy sect master didn't expect was that after Sang Xing's words, Xiao Chen, who wasn't far away, spoke softly without raising his head. Sang Xing, take him down and let Shen Hui personally go to the sword sect to take him back. Hearing Xiao Chen's words, the deputy sect master of the shrine's face instantly darkened. What was the meaning of this? Wasn't this a little too arrogant? Looking in the direction of the voice, the deputy sect master was stunned when he saw the calm face of Xiao Chen. Naturally, he had seen Xiao Chen before. He didn't expect that the sect master of the sword sect would actually appear here. For a moment, the deputy sect master couldn't help but feel nervous. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. Chapter 2243. If the deputy palace master of the shrines could still maintain his composure when facing Sang Xing, then when facing Xiao Chen, he couldn't help but feel nervous. One must know that Xiao Chen was the sect master of the sword sect. His status was on the same level as Shen Hui's. Moreover, Xiao Chen's cultivation had already broken through to the End Realm. The deputy palace master knew very well what it meant for a monster like Xiao Chen to break through to the End Realm. He had personally seen how strong Shenhui was after breaking through to the End Realm. He was definitely the strongest person below the Emperor Realm. Since Xiaochen could be on the same level as Shenhui, he definitely wouldn't be weak. The Deputy Palace Master didn't expect Xiaochen to actually appear in Jinlun City. The Deputy Palace Master unconsciously swallowed his saliva. He looked at Xiaochen with a serious expression and said, "Sect Master Xiaochen, this matter." His attitude was obviously completely different from before. Thinking about it, this Deputy Palace Master naturally didn't dare to be disrespectful in front of Xiaochen, let alone be arrogant. He wanted to explain, but before he could finish, Xiaochen interrupted him rudely. "Are you trying to say that this matter is a misunderstanding?" Xiaochen had already guessed what this deputy sect leader wanted to say. In response, Xiaochen sneered in his heart. Upon hearing these words, the deputy hall leader repeatedly nodded his head in agreement. At this point, what else could he do other than say that it was a misunderstanding? Seeing the deputy palace master nod repeatedly, Xiaochen said with an indifferent expression, "Is it just a misunderstanding?" Kicking down the courtyard door and walking in angrily was clearly an affront to Xiaochen. Moreover, those disciples were so disrespectful to Xiaochen just now. It was obvious that Xiaochen wanted an explanation. He also understood Xiaochen's meaning, so when he heard this, the deputy palace master gritted his teeth. He lowered his head and said to Xiaochen, "Sect Master Xiaochen is magnanimous. I was reckless today. I hope Sect Master Xiaochen can forgive me this time." He had no choice but to lower his head and admit his mistake. Otherwise, this deputy palace master knew that it would be difficult for him to walk out safely. Moreover, Shenhui didn't come personally this time, so in front of Xiaochen, he had to lower his head. He didn't make things difficult for this deputy palace master of the shrines. When he heard this, Xiaochen said indifferently, "Xiaochen, get lost." Similarly, he didn't want to complicate matters. When he heard Xiaochen's words, the deputy palace master immediately left with his people. He didn't want to stay here for even a second longer. He left Xiaochen's place in an extremely sorry state. However, because of this, the deputy palace master also received an extremely important piece of information. Xiaochen had actually come to Jinlun City personally. When he returned to the residence of the shrines and the other shrines with a gloomy face, another deputy palace master asked curiously, "What's wrong?" His face was so gloomy that it was about to drip water. Seeing this, the deputy palace master told him the truth about Xiaochen. When he heard that Xiaochen had actually come to Jinlun City personally, the other deputy palace master fell into deep thought. After a long while, he said, "I'm afraid this matter needs to be reported to the palace master." Xiaochen had personally come to Jinlun City. This was no small matter. After all, with Xiaochen's status, every move he made now could be said to be enough to change the situation of the Great Thousand World. Hence, there was no room for carelessness. They decided to report the news of Xiaochen's appearance in Jinlun City to Shenhui. Immediately, the two deputy palace masters took out their voice-transmitting talismans and sent a message to Shenhui. At the shrines, Shenhui was lazily leaning against a pavilion surrounded by a few beautiful women. Suddenly, a bright light flashed past and directly entered the space between Shenhui's eyebrows. Immediately, a smile appeared on Shenhui's face. He chuckled and said, "Xiaochen has personally gone to Jinlun City. Haha, interesting. That's Yinxing's territory." Obviously, this voice-transmitting talisman was sent by the two deputy palace masters in Jinlun City. They told Shenhui about Xiaochen's appearance in Jinlun City. After learning that Xiaochen had actually personally appeared in Jinlun City, Shenhui was curious. At the same time, he also had a premonition that the ancient relic this time would most likely be very interesting. This was because the 10,000 Weapons Mansion was the territory of the Heavenly Yin Tower. Furthermore, Xiaochen had personally brought people into the 10,000 Weapons Mansion. This was something that could not be ignored. A slight move in one hair would affect the whole body. Shenhui smiled slightly. Immediately after, he was silent for a moment. Then, he took out a voice-transmitting talisman and told Yinxing about this matter. Currently, the 10 Great Ling Tian sects, the shrines, the Heavenly Yin Tower, and the Yi Tian Mansion were considered to be in one camp. The Sword Sect, the Lunar Palace, and the Heavenly Policy Mansion were in another camp. Other than that, the Saber Sect and the Dan Valley were somewhat neutral. Hence, in terms of relationship, Shenhui was naturally more inclined towards the Heavenly Yin Tower. Hence, without much hesitation, Shenhui passed this news to Yin Sheng. Looking at Shenhui's smile, a beautiful woman at the side put her arm around Shenhui's shoulder intimately and said gently, "Husband, what happened?" "It's nothing." Hearing this, Shenhui smiled slightly. However, an inexplicable light flashed in his eyes. In Shenhui's opinion, Jinluan City would probably be very interesting this time. Xiaochen had personally appeared in Jinluan City. How would Yinsheng deal with this? Would he directly start a war with the Sword Sect? As he thought about this, Shenhui also replied to the 2 deputy hall masters of the shrines. He bluntly told them not to provoke Xiaochen again and to wait for the Heavenly Shadow Tower's response. In any case, the news had already been passed to Yinsheng. Next, it would depend on how Yinsheng would deal with this. For the time being, Shenhui did not want to offend Xiaochen. Hence, he did not take any substantial action. In the Heavenly Yin Tower, Yinsheng also quickly received Shenhui's message. After learning that Xiaochen had actually appeared in Jinluan City, a cold look flashed in Yinsheng's eyes. It could be said that he and Xiaochen were old rivals. Back then, in the Wood Realm, Yinsheng had been defeated by Xiaochen. After that, in all these years in the Great Thousand World, although the two of them had not exchanged blows, Yinsheng had never forgotten his defeat in the Wood Realm. It could be said that Xiaochen was the first person of the same generation to defeat Yinsheng. This had always bothered Yinsheng. In addition, given the relationship between the Heavenly Yin Tower and the Sword Sect, it was impossible for Yinsheng to pretend that he did not know that Xiaochen had actually entered the territory of the Myriad Weapon Residence and appeared in Jinluan City. A cold light flashed in Yinsheng's eyes. No one knew what he was thinking. Was he planning to directly attack Xiaochen? Was he going to kill Xiaochen in the territory of the Myriad Weapon Residence? However, it was obviously very difficult to do so. Since Xiaochen had rushed over, how could he not be prepared? Moreover, if it was really so easy to kill Xiaochen, the Sword Sect would have been destroyed long ago. At the same time, as the sect leader of the Sword Sect, if Xiaochen attacked Xiaochen, it was almost equivalent to starting a war with the Sword Sect. It should be known that starting a war with the Sword Sect now was not good news. There was still the Heavenly Policy Residence eyeing them covetously. Chapter 2244. Yinsheng was obviously a little nervous about Xiaochen's appearance in Jinluan City. After all, Xiaochen was now the sect leader of the Sword Sect. His every move could change the situation in the Great Thousand World, so he had to be on guard. Yinsheng was obviously a little nervous about Xiaochen's appearance in Jinluan City. After all, Xiaochen was now the sect leader of the Sword Sect. His every move could change the situation in the Great Thousand World, so he had to be on guard. However, looking at Xiaochen's actions, it seemed like he had no intention of attacking the Heavenly Yin Tower. Could it be that he came to Jinluan City for the ancient ruins? However, was a mere ancient ruin worth Xiaochen's personal visit? Although it was confirmed that the ancient ruins were left behind by the Reincarnation Emperor, although the Reincarnation Emperor was powerful, he was at most on par with Xiaochen's master, Jun Wuya. As a disciple of Jun Wuyuan, Xiaochen had inherited all of Jun Wuya's teachings. The inheritance of the Samsara Emperor was not that important to him. Yinsheng felt strange, but after weighing the pros and cons, he decided to make a trip to Jinluan City personally. After all, Xiaochen was now in Jinluan City, so Yinsheng could not be careless. Yinsheng left the Heavenly Yin Tower on the same day with Su Ming and the other experts and rushed to Jinluan City. However, just like Xiaochen, Yinsheng's trip was extremely secretive. He did not tell anyone, and even the city governor's mansion of Jinluan City did not know that Yinsheng had come to Jinluan City. In Jinluan City, Xiaochen and the others were waiting for the ancient ruins to open. However, after the incident with the shrines, Song Xing, Lin Qing, and the others felt that it was a little troublesome. The shrines must have known that Xiaochen was in Jinluan City by now. Sect leader, do you think we need the shrines? Song Xing asked worriedly as they sat together and drank wine. In Song Xing's opinion, the shrine should have sent some spies to keep an eye on Shenhui's every move. However, Xiaochen merely smiled and said, "There's no need. Shenhui won't come." Shenhui must have already known that he was in Jinluan City. Xiaochen was even certain that Shenhui had already told Yinsheng about this. However, Shenhui would not personally come to Jinluan City. Based on the current relationship between the Sword Sect and the shrines, the Divine Splendor would not take the initiative to provoke the Sword Sect. Compared to the Divine Splendor, Yinsheng and the Heavenly Yin Tower should be on their guard. After all, this was the Myriad Weapon Residence's territory, the Heavenly Yin Tower's territory. Once Yinsheng found out about him, Xiaochen wasn't sure what he would do. Would Yinsheng take this opportunity to take a gamble and see if he could stay in the Myriad Weapon Residence forever? Or would he retreat in the face of difficulties and endure silently? If Yinsheng wanted to attack him, Xiaochen would naturally have no choice but to fight back. When that happened, the Sword Sect and the Heavenly Yin Tower would probably have to fight again. However, this was something that couldn't be helped. Xiaochen had to come because this matter concerned Xian Yuanling. Even if he had to fight with the Heavenly Yin Tower, Xiaochen wouldn't hesitate. It still depended on Yinsheng's own choice. However, in Xiaochen's opinion, the possibility of Yinsheng attacking him wasn't high. However, he still had to be on guard. Time passed day by day, and more people gathered in Jinluan City. However, this didn't affect Xiaochen much. During these few days, Xiaochen and his group lived in seclusion and rarely went out. Xiaochen patiently waited for the ruins to open. In the Jinluan City's city lord's residence, Yinsheng had already brought people to Jinluan City 3 days ago. However, he chose to keep the news of his arrival a secret. At this moment, in the pavilion in the backyard of the city lord's residence, Yinsheng was drinking tea as he spoke to a Heavenly Yin Tower expert beside him. "How is it? Is there still no movement from Xiaochen's side?" Replying the sect master, "There isn't. It seems like they are really waiting for the ruins to open." Hearing this, the Heavenly Yin Tower expert replied truthfully. "Came for the ruins?" Hearing this, Yinsheng didn't believe it at all. He didn't believe that Xiaochen would enter the Myriad Weapon Residence and personally come to Jinluan City for a mere ancient ruin. To ordinary warriors, the Reincarnation Emperor's ruins were indeed very attractive. However, to people like Xiaochen, there was nothing to be concerned about. Therefore, Yinsheng didn't believe that Xiaochen came for the ruins. This was simply impossible. He must have other motives, and this was what Yinsheng was concerned about. "Go. Continue to monitor, but don't act rashly and alert the enemy." Hearing this, Yinsheng waved his hand and said. After leaving with this expert, Yinsheng's eyes revealed a look of contemplation. He couldn't help but ask, "Xiaochen, what exactly are you doing in Jinluan City?" Yinsheng couldn't figure out Xiaochen's motive for personally coming to Jinluan City. The people outside obviously didn't expect that there were 2 sect masters of the 10 great Ling Tian sects in Jinluan City. If the people outside knew that Xiaochen and Yinsheng had personally come to Jinluan City would probably become the center of attention of the entire Great Thousand World. There was nothing special about it. Very few people knew about the existence of Xiaochen and Yinsheng. In this peaceful wait, another 5 days passed. Late at night, the ruins, which had been quiet for a long time, suddenly shot up into the sky with a golden light. This golden light naturally attracted the attention of many warriors. For a time, many people flew towards the entrance of the ruins outside the city. The relic is finally going to open. Many warriors thought excitedly. After waiting for so many days, the ruins finally opened. Everyone was naturally excited. Meanwhile, in Xiaochen's residence, Zhangxing looked at the golden light that soared into the sky outside the city. He looked at Xiaochen and said, "Sect Master, yes, let's go." Hearing this, Xiaochen nodded calmly. After hearing Xiaochen's words, the group immediately rushed towards the ruins outside the city. Although it was already late at night at the entrance of the ruins, more and more people were gathering. However, with so many people, they were divided into several camps. First, there were a few major forces who occupied the best positions. They were the Shrines, Moon Palace, Saber Sect, and Heavenly Sect. These major forces occupied the best positions, which were also the closest to the entrance. Regarding this, no one dared to have the slightest objection. The 10 Great Ling Tian sects were like 10 pillars in the Great Thousand World, supporting the entire Great Thousand World. In particular, after the division of the 10 prefectures, the 10 Great Ling Tian sects' control of the Great Thousand World had reached a peak. If any force wanted to survive, they had to rely on the 10 Great Ling Tian sects. Therefore, it was understandable that the 10 Great Ling Tian sects occupied the best positions. At the location where the shrines were, the 2 deputy shrines who were in charge of leading the team kept looking in the direction of Jinlun City. One of them asked worriedly, "Do you think that Xiaochen will show up today?" The shrines knew that Xiaochen had personally come to Jinlun City, so they were also guessing whether Xiaochen would show up today. If Xiaochen showed up, what should the shrines do? Should they hand over the ruins, take advantage of the chaos, or fight fiercely? Chapter 2245. They were somewhat nervous about Xiaochen's arrival. After all, the Divine Splendor had not personally come to Jinlun City. As such, the 2 deputy palace masters of the shrines naturally felt a lot of pressure when facing Xiaochen. Just as the 2 of them were secretly nervous, more than 10 figures descended from the sky at the place closest to the entrance of the ruins, directly occupying the position closest to the entrance. Someone actually dared to bypass the shrines and the lunar palace and stand directly at the entrance of the relic. Seeing this scene, everyone's expression froze, but no one dared to say anything. After all, the shrines and the lunar palace were standing in front of them. Since someone dared to bypass them and temporarily occupy the entrance, the shrines and the lunar palace would definitely not turn a blind eye to it. Everyone was waiting for the shrines and the lunar palace's reaction. Some people even felt that the sudden appearance of more than 10 people was simply courting death. Did they not see that even the shrines and the lunar palace did not dare to be so arrogant? Everyone was from the 10 Great Ling Tian sects, and no one was willing to submit to the other. Naturally, everyone took a step back. Everyone knew that the hunter would shoot the bird that sticks out. However, the sudden appearance of more than 10 people obviously did not know this. They were actually so arrogant the moment they arrived. However, amidst the shock, some people quickly recognized the newcomers. Someone exclaimed, "They are from the Sword Sect." The sudden appearance of more than 10 people was indeed Xiaochen's group. As the sect leader of the Sword Sect, Xiaochen was naturally able to suppress the shrines and the lunar palace. After all, people like the Divine Splendor and the Dao Ju had not personally come to Jinlun City. There was no doubt that Xiaochen's status was the highest among those present. As such, there was naturally no problem for him to suppress the shrines and the other forces. As everyone's identities were recognized, Xiaochen naturally became the focus of everyone's attention. At first, no one recognized Xiaochen's identity. However, as the 2 deputy palace masters of the lunar palace took the initiative to step forward and bowed respectfully to Xiaochen, they called out, "Sect leader Xiaochen." Upon hearing this, everyone finally recognized Xiaochen's identity. It was no wonder he dared to be so arrogant. It turned out that the sect leader of the Sword Sect, Xiaochen, had personally come. In this case, the Sword Sect indeed had a reason to be arrogant. No one present could compete with Xiaochen, and the Lunar Palace Masters of the Lunar Palace, and the Lunar Palace Masters. Of course, Xiaochen did not have to give anyone face. In the face of the 2 deputy palace masters of the Lunar Palace, Xiaochen nodded slightly and said, yes, the lunar palace should not interfere in this matter of the ruins. It's meaningless. I will personally inform fourth senior sister about the details. In Xiao Chen's opinion, the various treasures in the ruins had probably been plundered by Shen Yuanling. The most important thing, the reincarnation emperor's inheritance, must have been obtained by Shen Yuanling as well. Therefore, there was nothing valuable left in the ancient ruins in front of them. Due to the relationship between Xiao Xiao and Xiao Chen, the lunar palace and the sword sect were like allies. Therefore, Xiao Chen did not mince his words to the two deputy palace masters of the lunar palace. Upon hearing Xiao Chen's words, the two deputy palace masters were slightly taken aback, but they still nodded in agreement. Since Xiao Chen had personally spoken, the two deputy palace masters of the lunar palace naturally would not refuse. They immediately nodded in agreement. Although the lunar palace did not have any objections to Xiao Chen's words, one of the deputy sect masters of the heavenly sect snorted unhappily and said, "Humph, who do you think you are? Do you think we will give up just because of a few words? The heavenly sect should have been destroyed the last time." However, they were lucky enough to meet an idiot like Long Mie. With the help of the Dragon Palace, the heavenly sect was able to come back from the dead. However, upon hearing the deputy sect master's words, Lin Qing, who was standing beside Xiao Chen, turned his head and shouted angrily, "Do you want to die?" Xiao Chen was the sect master of the sword sect. How could he allow others to humiliate him? Lin Qing was about to draw his sword when Xiao Chen waved his hand. He then looked at the deputy sect master of the heavenly sect and said indifferently, "You won't be so lucky every time." The heavenly sect managed to escape the previous time. However, I don't know if the heavenly sect will be so lucky next time. Xiao Chen's only purpose in coming to Jinlun City was to find Shen Yuanling. Therefore, he did not want to cause any trouble. Moreover, now was not the time to attack the heavenly sect. Currently, Xiao Chen was most wary of the heavenly Yin Tower. After all, this was the heavenly Yin Tower's territory. However, after hearing Xiao Chen's words, the deputy sect master of the heavenly sect turned pale. This was because everyone knew that the heavenly sect was almost destroyed by the sword sect. It was also because they lost to the sword sect that the heavenly sect was now at the bottom of the 10 great Ling Tian sects. Almost everyone believed that the heavenly sect was the weakest and the sword sect was obviously stronger than the heavenly sect. This was because the heavenly sect was defeated by the sword sect. With a pale face, the deputy sect master of the heavenly sect did not say anything else. This was because he knew what he was capable of in front of Xiao Chen. Moreover, Yan Chen was not present this time. If they were to clash with the sword sect, the heavenly sect would definitely be at a disadvantage. At that time, if they were to be ruthlessly humiliated by the sword sect in front of so many people, the heavenly sect's face would be completely lost. Seeing that the deputy sect master of the heavenly sect did not say anything else, Xiao Chen could not be bothered with him. Lin Qing, on the other hand, glared at him fiercely before turning his head away. However, at this moment, a voice with obvious hostility sounded. Sect Master Xiao is still as overbearing as before. Along with the voice, Yinxing also appeared with more than 10 heavenly Yin Tower's experts. Yinxing's appearance caused everyone's expression to change slightly. Originally, they thought that it was just an ordinary relic that appeared. Who would have thought that it would actually attract 2 sect masters of the 10 great Ling Tian sects? It should be known that with the foundation of the 10 great Ling Tian sects, they would definitely not place too much importance on the emperor's relic. What a joke! There were already living emperors in the sect. Who would be interested in a dead person? However, it was precisely because of this that the reincarnation emperor's relic had attracted both Xiao Chen and Yinsheng. As the saying goes, when enemies meet, their eyes blaze with hatred. The two of them who already had a grudge against each other met again. Yinsheng was obviously filled with hostility while Xiao Chen chuckled. What does it have to do with you whether I'm overbearing or not? Indeed, Xiao Chen did not have a good impression of Yinsheng. Both of them had been like this since the first time they met in the wood boundary. Now that the heavenly policy mansion was here, it was even more so for Xiao Chen. After all, Between the Heavenly Policy Mansion and the Heavenly Yin Tower, Xiaochen would definitely choose the Heavenly Policy Mansion and Li Chun. As such, it was destined that Xiaochen and Yinxing could only stand on opposite sides. It was impossible for them to become friends. Chapter 2246. Facing Yinxing, Xiaochen didn't give him any face. Since they were destined to be enemies, why should he feign civility? Facing Yinxing, Xiaochen didn't give him any face. Since they were destined to be enemies, why should he feign civility? Hearing Xiaochen's words, Yinxing also snorted coldly. He looked at Xiaochen with eyes full of coldness and said coldly, "Let's see how long you can be arrogant." He didn't know why, but every time he faced Xiaochen, Yinxing couldn't help but burn with anger. However, he couldn't do anything to Xiaochen. Although Yinxing was now the sect master of the Tianyin Tower, Xiaochen wasn't afraid of him at all. Moreover, it seemed that every time he fought with Xiaochen, he was the one who suffered in the end. Without saying anything more, Yinxing didn't choose to take action. Because until now, he still didn't know the purpose of Xiaochen's visit. He thought of many possibilities, but they were all rejected by Yinxing in the end. He really couldn't figure out why Xiaochen would appear here. Before he figured out the purpose of Xiaochen's visit, Yinxing didn't want to take action rashly. On the other side, Xiaochen didn't have much of a change in expression when he saw Yinxing's arrival. However, he smiled bitterly in his heart. Although he had already guessed that Yinxing would definitely come personally, after all, it was related to him. Yinxing couldn't turn a blind eye to it. However, after seeing Yinxing in person, Xiaochen still felt a little helpless. Because of Yinxing's presence, who knew what kind of trouble he would cause? However, no matter what, he had to deal with it accordingly. Anyway, Xiaochen's purpose was to help Xian Yuanling. As long as Xian Yuanling was safe, Xiaochen's purpose would be achieved. The appearance of Xiaochen and Yinxing brought a great deal of pressure to everyone present. At this moment, everyone outside the ruins was extremely cautious, afraid that they would offend these two great gods. Even the people of Shrines, Moon Palace, and Saber's sect restrained themselves a lot at this time. There was no other way. Xiaochen and Yinxing had come in person. They didn't dare to provoke them unless their sect masters were also present. But now, they naturally didn't dare to provoke Xiaochen and Yinxing. Everyone was quietly waiting for the relic to open. Fortunately, it didn't take long before the seal around the relic slowly disappeared. A wisp of excitement flashed through everyone's eyes when they saw this. The ruins had finally been opened. However, because Xiaochen and Yinxing didn't move, the surrounding people naturally didn't dare to act rashly. Although the ruins had been opened, there was a hierarchy in order to enter. Xiaochen and Yinxing didn't move, so the others naturally didn't dare to move, including powerful forces like Shrines and Moon Palace. Xiaochen didn't have any intention to enter the ruins because Xiaochen wasn't interested in it at all. Seeing that Xiaochen didn't understand, Yinxing didn't have the slightest intention to enter either. His eyes glanced at Xiaochen from time to time. He knew very well that Yinxing's attention was all on him at this time. Yinxing wasn't interested in the ruins either. An ancient ruin was nothing in Yinxing's heart. Compared to Xiaochen, it was simply negligible. Knowing that Yinxing was staring at him, Xiaochen didn't say anything. Instead, he looked at the surrounding cultivators and said, "If you want to enter, then do it." So many people were waiting for him and Yinxing to move, but Xiaochen didn't have any intention to enter the ruins from the beginning to the end. Therefore, he opened his mouth to let the others do as they pleased. These people were all here for the ruins. Letting them enter might save them a lot of trouble later. After all, the inheritance in the ruins must have been obtained by Xian Yuanling. If they were allowed to enter and search for it, when Xian Yuanling came out, Xiaochen could take the opportunity to take Xian Yuanling away. Xiaochen said in a seemingly generous manner. Hearing this, Yinxing frowned and thought to himself, sure enough, Xiaochen didn't come here for this ancient ruin at all. Yinxing was already sure that Xiaochen didn't come here for this ancient ruin. However, the others didn't think so much. Hearing Xiao Chen's words, someone finally couldn't help but stand up and cupped his hands towards Xiao Chen. Since Sect Master Xiao said so, my heavenly eye sword sect thanks Sect Master Xiao. After saying this, he directly led his people into the ruins. Xiao Chen didn't stop him at all. With someone taking the lead, the rest was naturally easy to handle. Not long after, the crowd entered the ruins one after another, ignoring Xiao Chen and Yin Sheng who were standing at the entrance. Naturally, the crowd didn't kill them. They could see that Xiao Chen and Yin Sheng didn't care about the ruins at all. Since that was the case, they naturally wouldn't let go of this opportunity. Group after group of people entered the ruins. Soon, there were only 4 groups left outside the entrance: Xiao Chen, Yin Sheng, the shrines of the ruins, and the Moon Palace. The Moon Palace obeyed Xiao Chen and gave up on the ruins. Therefore, they didn't enter. As for the shrines, they were similar to the Moon Palace. They had received orders from Shenhui and had given up on the ruins long ago. Only the 4 groups were left. At this time, Xiao Chen still had a calm expression on his face. Very quickly, half a day passed. Yin Sheng and Xiao Chen stood at the entrance for half a day. After such a long time, Xiao Chen still didn't make the slightest move. This made Yin Sheng even more puzzled. What exactly was Xiao Chen's purpose? However, just as Yin Sheng was secretly puzzled, a figure slowly walked out from the entrance of the ruins. After seeing who it was, Yin Sheng finally understood. The person who had come was none other than Xiao Chen's elder brother, Xian Yuanling. Although Yin Sheng had never met Xian Yuanling, he had heard of him long ago. After all, the matter of Xiao Chen and his 2 siblings was no secret in the Great Thousand World. Moreover, Yin Sheng paid special attention to Xiao Chen. Naturally, he had a special understanding of Xiao Chen's deeds. Seeing Xian Yuanling appear here, Yin Sheng quickly figured everything out. There had long been rumors that Xiao Chen's elder brother, Xian Yuanling, cultivated the power of samsara. In this way, it wasn't strange for him to appear here. It must be because of the inheritance of the samsara emperor. Moreover, it seemed that he had already obtained the inheritance. Xiao Chen had personally come to Jinluan City to receive his elder brother. After understanding all this, Yin Sheng immediately looked at Xiao Chen with a cold smile and said, "Great sect leader Xiao is indeed scheming. His elder brother has already obtained the inheritance of this ruins. Great sect leader Xiao is still keeping it a secret. You have fooled us." As soon as Yin Sheng said this, Xiao Chen's eyes gradually turned cold. "Why? Are you trying to stop me?" How could Xiao Chen not understand the meaning of Yin Sheng's words? At the same time, Xian Yuanling also came to Xiao Chen's side. He first looked at Yin Sheng warily, then said somewhat worriedly, "Third brother. Big brother, don't worry. Everything will be fine." Xian Yuanling obviously knew that Yin Sheng had come with ill intentions. However, Xiao Chen gave him a reassuring look, indicating that he would handle it. Chapter 2247. After indicating that Xian Yuanling was fine, Xiao Chen once again looked at Yin Sheng. Facing Xiao Chen's gaze, the smile on Yin Sheng's face became even colder. "I didn't say that. However, shouldn't Sect Master Xiao give everyone an explanation for doing this?" As soon as Yin Sheng said this, a cold glint flashed across Xiao Chen's eyes. This guy's words made him stand on the opposite side of everyone present. Thinking about it, there were so many people present. Almost all the people from the major forces were present. Now, the inheritance and treasures in the ruins were all obtained by Xian Yuanling. One could imagine what everyone would think. The purpose of so many people gathering here was self-evident. It was for the ruins. But now, the ruins had been emptied by Xian Yuanling. Wouldn't this make everyone's trip in vain? Yin Sheng's heart gradually turned cold. He was obviously trying to provoke a conflict between the sword sect and everyone present, while he reaped the benefits. However, it was also at this time that some of the people who had entered the ruins began to return one after another. Everyone's face showed some displeasure, not for other reasons, because in the end, they did not find anything in the ruins. This was an empty ruin, so everyone was naturally disappointed. However, although they were disappointed, no one dared to vent their anger on Xiao Chen and Yin Sheng. Therefore, when they saw that Xiao Chen and Yin Sheng were still at the entrance of the ruins, many people forced a smile and said, "Sect Master Xiao, Sect Master Yin, this ruin is empty. It seems that we have made a trip in vain." After all, they were unwilling to get involved in the conflict between Yin Sheng and Xiao Chen. As mortals, they were not qualified to participate in a fight between immortals. However, at this moment, Yin Sheng said with a smile, "Everyone, don't be anxious. I know that this is an empty ruin. However, don't you want to know why this is an empty ruin?" As Yin Sheng said this, he looked at Xiao Chen with a cold smile. Hearing Yin Sheng's words, everyone who returned from the ruins had different expressions. However, they all stopped in their tracks. Everyone also wanted to know what was going on. Seeing that everyone was interested in this, the smile on Yin Sheng's face became even brighter as he said unhurriedly, "Actually, we have to ask Sect Master Xiao of our sword sect, or rather, we have to ask Sect Master Zhao's sworn brother, Xian Yuanling." As soon as Yin Sheng said this, everyone's eyes involuntarily looked at Xiao Chen and Xian Yuanling. At the same time, after a pause, Yin Sheng continued. "Actually, Xian Yuanling was already in the relic before it was opened. It's very normal for everyone to gain nothing after entering the relic because the inheritance and various treasures of the relic are currently with Xian Yuanling." The moment these words were spoken, everyone looked at Xian Yuanling with eyes that clearly carried a hint of hostility. Thinking about it, it was normal. Everyone gathered here from all over the Great Thousand World in order to find an opportunity in the ruins. However, in the end, it was all for naught. This was obviously unacceptable. Sensing the hostility in everyone's eyes, Yin Sheng sneered in his heart. Now that Xiao Chen had angered everyone, if they were to fight, this motley crew might not be a match for the sword sect. However, Yin Sheng would definitely be happy to see this. After all, no matter how strong the sword sect was, how could they offend all the sects in the Great Thousand World? If that was the case, it would be enough to make the sword sect suffer and even destroy the sword sect. Yin Sheng's move was indeed a little sinister. However, just as he was secretly sneering, Xiao Chen suddenly spoke. "The inheritance and treasures of the ruins were indeed obtained by my elder brother," Xiao Chen said slowly without any change in his expression. He did not deny what he had said. After all, it was impossible to hide such a thing even if he wanted to, so he might as well admit it openly. Seeing that Xiao Chen had taken the initiative to admit it, everyone present was stunned. However, before they could recover from their shock, Xiao Chen continued. "However, my elder brother has obtained the inheritance of the Reincarnation Emperor. It's not an exaggeration to say that he's the successor of the Reincarnation Emperor. Moreover, my elder brother was the first to discover the ruins. Before the ruins were discovered, my elder brother had already found the location of the ruins. Therefore, even if it's based on who came first, the ruins should belong to my elder brother," Xiao Chen said plainly. Hearing this, everyone present had different expressions. Some felt that Xiao Chen's words made sense, while others felt that they were not convinced. After memorizing everyone's expressions, Xiao Chen continued. "However, since everyone has come a long way and obtained nothing, and in addition, everything in the ruins was indeed obtained by my elder brother, my sword sect will naturally not be unreasonable. As the sect master of the sword sect, I, Xiao Chen, can once again promise everyone that my sword sect will definitely compensate everyone." Xiao Chen was willing to compensate everyone present. Hearing this, many people's expressions eased up slightly. Although they knew that the sword sect's compensation might not be comparable to the treasures in the ruins, they had still obtained something. It was actually enough. Moreover, Xiao Chen had already done everything he could. With the sword sect's current strength and influence, what could they do even if there was no compensation? Could it be that they really dared to become enemies with the sword sect? Sure enough, after saying these words, Xiao Chen's eyes quickly revealed a trace of coldness. At the same time, a terrifying aura surged from his body. His domineering gaze swept across everyone present as he spoke in a deep voice. However, if anyone believes the nonsense of others and harbors resentment towards my sword sect, or even wants to cause trouble, then I can accompany you to the end. That's all I have to say. Everyone, make your own choice. Those who are willing to believe in me can leave now. In a few days, the sword sect will naturally send compensation to you. If you want to become enemies with the sword sect, feel free to stay. However, you will have to bear the consequences. First, he offered everyone compensation for their deaths, and then he made an undisguised threat. Following Xiao Chen's words, everyone present was silent for a few breaths. Many of them secretly looked at each other, and soon someone made a choice. Sect Master Xiao, please forgive us. We naturally don't dare to become enemies with the sword sect. We'll leave now. After the first person left, a second person quickly followed. Since Xiao Chen had already given them enough face and even didn't hesitate to compensate them, they naturally wouldn't fail to appreciate his kindness. If they really angered Xiao Chen, then it wouldn't be too difficult for the sword sect to annihilate them. Begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. Chapter 2248. Xiao Chen knew the consequences of angering the crowd. With so many people present, it was impossible for him to not give them an explanation. Therefore, Xiao Chen could only give some compensation. He was very clear that no matter how strong a force was, it was far from being able to go against the entire world. Unless the Swords Gate had already dominated the Great Thousand World, then it would still be fine. However, that was not the case. The current Swords Gate was only one of the top 10 Ling Tian sects and was far from being able to dominate the Great Thousand World. Xiao Chen gave everyone present enough, and the many cultivators present were obviously not stupid. They immediately nodded and left one after another. Seeing that Xiao Chen had resolved all of this with just a few words, the cold light in Yinsheng's eyes became even more vigorous. Originally, Yinsheng had intended to provoke a conflict between the sword sect and the various forces present. This way, Yinsheng would have an opportunity to kill Xiao Chen here. However, it seemed that such an opportunity did not exist now. The people of the various forces were stunned by Xiao Chen with just a few words. Although Yinsheng also knew that Xiao Chen would have to pay a huge price for the compensation he promised, it was impossible for him to attack Xiao Chen today. Of course, Yinsheng could also choose to fight Xiao Chen by force. However, if he did that, the chances of him killing Xiao Chen would be very small. He would only be able to vent the anger in his heart. After becoming the sect master of the Heavenly Yin Tower, Yinsheng was no longer as naive as he was in the wood boundary. He knew that he had to deal with everything calmly and weigh the pros and cons. Now, it was obviously meaningless to attack Xiao Chen by force. After taking a deep breath, Yinsheng quickly put on a smile and looked at Xiao Chen. Great Sect Master Xiao, you're indeed a good person. Same here, Xiao Chen replied plainly. Xiao Chen had no intention of fighting Yinsheng at this time because it was also meaningless. The two of them looked at each other and their gazes collided in the air. Then, Xiao Chen spoke first. Let's go. Xiao Chen prepared to leave. Yinsheng did not stop him. He watched Xiao Chen leave with a cold gaze. After Xiao Chen disappeared, Yinsheng left with his people with a cold expression. The appearance of the ancient ruins, which should have been an intense competition, ended just like that. Many cultivators could be said to have made a wasted trip. However, it was not that they did not gain anything. After all, the sword sect would give them a certain amount of compensation. They did not continue to stay in the 10,000 weapon mansion. After all, this was the territory of the Heavenly Yin Tower. Although Yinsheng did not attack, who knew if he had any other schemes? Along the way, they did not encounter any ambushes from the Heavenly Yin Tower. Xiao Chen heaved a sigh of relief as the group entered the Sword Mansion safely. After safely entering the Sword Mansion, Xiao Chen and the rest slowed down. At the same time, Xiaochen and Xian Yuanling talked about what had happened in the past few years. Xian Yuanling did not have much to say. After leaving the sword sect, Xian Yuanling came directly to the ancient ruins to receive the inheritance of the reincarnation emperor. It could be said that he had received the inheritance of the reincarnation emperor. Xian Yuanling's cultivation had broken through to the great perfection of the Dao realm. He only needed one more step to break through to the end realm. Xiaochen was naturally happy to see such an improvement. This also showed how powerful the inheritance of the reincarnation emperor was. No wonder even Jun Weiyao was full of praise when he talked about the reincarnation emperor. It seemed like the reincarnation emperor was not simple. Xian Yuanling did not have much to say. However, what Xiaochen told Xian Yuanling shocked him. Firstly, the sword sect defeated the heavenly sect and was now one of the 10 great Ling Tian sects. Secondly, it was the destruction of the Dragon Palace. So many big things had happened in the Great Thousand World. After hearing Xiaochen's description, Xian Yuanling was so shocked that he was speechless for a long time. Fortunately, nothing happened to Long Qing. This was the most gratifying thing. They returned to the sword sect safely. Long Qing was also very happy to see Xian Yuanling. However, at this moment, there were 2 pairs of big eyes looking at Xian Yuanling curiously. These 2 were Xiaochen's sons, Xiao Yao and Xiao Lao. These 2 brats had just turned 6 years old. It was the time for them to be mischievous. The 2 brats were also filled with curiosity towards Xian Yuanling, whom they had never seen before. This was because they could tell that this person had an unusual relationship with their father and mother. Xiaochen naturally saw Xiao Yao and Xiao Lao. He waved at them and said, "This is your uncle. Hurry up and greet him." Xian Yuanling and Xiaochen were sworn brothers. Naturally, he was Xiao Yao and Xiao Lao's uncle. Hearing this, the 2 boys called out timidly, "Uncle." Xiaochen was very strict with the 2 boys. He was different from Qin Shuru and the other girls. Therefore, when facing Xiaochen, Xiao Yao and Xiao Lao seemed to be a little afraid of their father. However, it was strange. Although they were afraid, these 2 boys liked to stick to Xiaochen. Hearing this, Xian Yuanling smiled and nodded. He sighed in his heart. After a period of seclusion, Xiaochen already had 2 fat boys. Xian Yuanling liked the 2 boys very much. Xiaochen also said that he hoped that Xian Yuanling would accept Xiao Yao as his disciple. Xiao Lao had already become Long Qing's disciple. Xiao Yao naturally wanted to become Xian Yuanling's disciple. In this regard, Xian Yuanling naturally would not refuse. He simply nodded and agreed. Immediately, under Xiaochen's request, Xiao Yao bowed 3 times and kowtowed 9 times. She also served tea and became Xian Yuanling's disciple. In the courtyard, Xian Yuanling sat on a stone bench. In front of him, Xiao Yao raised a teacup and served tea to Xian Yuanling. After taking a sip of tea, Xian Yuanling officially accepted Xiao Yao as his disciple. Xiao Yao also addressed Xian Yuanling as master. Xian Yuanling's safe return and Xiao Yao becoming his disciple made Xiaochen's mood very good. That night, everyone gathered together to drink and chat. The 3 siblings had not gathered together to drink for a long time. For the 3 of them, this was the happiest moment of their lives. However, at this moment, a sword elder came and said that he wanted to see Xiaochen. Xiaochen did not know what it was about, but he still nodded and agreed. Soon, the sword elder came before Xiaochen. He first bowed respectfully to Xiaochen, then said with an ugly expression, "Sect Master, young miss. Young miss killed someone." The young miss mentioned by the sword elder was undoubtedly Xiao Luan. Xiao Luan was now an inner disciple of the sword sect. Hearing that Xiao Luan had killed someone, Xiaochen frowned slightly. Even Qin Shuru and the other girls came forward and asked with complicated expressions, "What happened?" Chapter 2249. Qin Shuru and the other ladies revealed worried expressions when they heard that Xiao Wan had killed someone. The Sword Elder answered truthfully. It's someone from the family Nangong. Qin Shuru and the other ladies revealed worried expressions. It's someone from the family Nangong. According to the Sword Elder, Xiao Wan got into an argument with an inner disciple of the family Nangong for some unknown reason. Then, Xiao Wan unsheathed her sword and killed the family Nangong disciple. The matter was not complicated. However, killing someone in the sect, especially a fellow disciple, was obviously against the rules of the Sword's Gate. After hearing the elder's explanation, Qin Shuru and the other girls immediately wanted to go and see what was going on. However, Xiaochen said indifferently, "What are you going to do? Let the law enforcement hall handle it." Qin Shuru and the other ladies revealed displeased expressions when they heard Xiaochen's words. Wouldn't Xiao Wan have to suffer if the law enforcement hall handled the matter? After all, it was a fact that Xiao Wan had killed a fellow disciple in public. How can you do this? No, I have to go take a look. Gu Lingyao and Hong Xiu, who had a fiery temper, didn't care about Xiaochen's obstruction and left immediately. The two ladies were worried about Xiao Wan. They were afraid that Xiao Wan would be taken advantage of. However, as the headmaster of Sword's Gate, Xiaochen had to consider the entire Sword's Gate. Even if Xiao Wan was his daughter, he could not openly violate the rules of the Sword's Gate. However, the matter hadn't been clarified and they didn't know why Xiao Wan had killed someone. Therefore, it wasn't easy to come to a conclusion. Xiaochen let out a helpless sigh and said to the Sword Elder, "Let the law enforcement hall handle it. Let me know after they find out the reason." Xiaochen believed that Xiao Wan would not kill someone for no reason. There must be a reason behind this. Hearing this, the elder nodded respectfully. The law enforcement hall was in charge of the Sword Sect's laws and regulations, and Nangong Guan happened to be the vice sect master in charge of the law enforcement hall. At this time, several elders of the law enforcement hall had already gathered in Nangong Guan's residence. Looking at Nangong Guan, who was sitting on the main seat, these elders all had grave expressions on their faces. This time, Xiao Wan's incident was not a small matter. Moreover, it happened to involve the family Nangong. Moreover, Xiao Wan was Xiaochen's daughter. If something went wrong, Xiaochen might be unhappy. With a heavy expression, Nangong Guan sat on the main seat without saying a word, but soon, the Sword Elder who had met with Xiaochen returned. Seeing this, Nangong Guan asked, "What did Sect Master say?" Reporting to Vice Sect Leader, Sect Leader's intention is to investigate the cause of the matter before making a decision. Hearing this, the Sword Head Elder replied truthfully. Xiaochen did not have any intention of siding with Xiao Wan. Of course, this was on the premise that Xiao Wan was in the wrong. Hearing this, Nangong Guan nodded slightly and said, "Go to the law enforcement hall and summon Xiao Wan and everyone related to this matter." Within the law enforcement hall, Nangong Guan and the other elders of the law enforcement hall quickly gathered. Xiao Wan and everyone related to this incident were all brought to the law enforcement hall. However, just as everyone was preparing to interrogate Xiao Wan, Gu Lingyao and Hong Xiu barged in. Gu Lingyao said with a displeased expression, "Senior brother Nangong, it shouldn't be a problem for the two of us to listen in, right?" The two women were obviously afraid that Xiao Wan would be taken advantage of, so they specially came. Seeing the two women arrive, Nangong Guan revealed a bitter smile and nodded. Of course. Gu Lingyao and Hong Xiu were both Xiaochen's women, so Nangong Guan naturally would not offend them for no reason. Moreover, just listening in wasn't a big deal. An elder personally brought over 2 chairs for the two women. After the two women sat down, Xiao Wan and 2 inner court disciples were brought over. Seeing Xiao Wan, Gu Lingyao and Hong Xiu nodded slightly, indicating that she did not need to be afraid. As for the young man beside Xiao Wan, when he saw Nangong Guan, he immediately cried out, "Uncle, you have to uphold justice for my family Nangong." The young man's name was Nangong Xiulin, and he was a direct descendant of the family Nangong. He could be considered Nangong Guan's nephew, and he was very talented. he was the leader of Nangongguan's younger generation. Nangongguan didn't expect that this matter would involve Nangong Xiaolin. She frowned and shouted in a deep voice, "Nonsense! There is no uncle here. I am the vice-sect master of the sword sect, the hall master of the law enforcement hall." Nangong Xiaolin immediately called her uncle, which made Nangongguan feel a bit gloomy. Didn't he see that Guling Yao and Hong Xiu were still sitting there? Was he trying to compete with Xiaoluan in terms of background by claiming to be relatives? What an idiot! After being reprimanded by Nangongguan, Nangong Xiaolin immediately changed his way of addressing her. Nangongguan then began to ask about the matter. According to him, Xiaoluan had killed people indiscriminately. Because of a small matter, Xiaoluan had drawn her sword and killed people. Furthermore, according to Nangong Xiaolin, Xiaoluan had become a little tyrant in the inner court. Relying on her status and background, Xiaoluan had committed all sorts of outrages in the inner court. She had bullied the weak and violated the sex rules. Hearing Nangong Xiaolin's story, Guling Yao and Hong Xiaolin couldn't help but frown slightly. With their understanding of Xiaoluan, it was obvious that Xiaoluan wouldn't do such a thing. However, after Nangong Xiaolin finished speaking, the other inner court disciple beside her also nodded and confirmed that what Nangong Xiaolin said was true. Facing Nangong Xiaolin and Hong Xiaolin's accusations, Xiaoluan didn't interrupt. Her expression was incomparably calm. Apart from nodding when she saw Guling Yao and Hong Xiaolin at the beginning, Xiaoluan had closed her eyes and rested. It was as if everything before her had nothing to do with her. When Nangong Xiaolin finished speaking, Nangongguan finally looked at Xiaoluan. Seeing Xiaoluan's calm expression, Nangongguan was secretly curious, but she still asked, "Xiaoluan, do you have anything to say?" Hearing Nangongguan's question, Xiaoluan slowly opened her eyes and said in a neither servile nor overbearing manner, "Yes." As she spoke, Xiaoluan cast a disdainful glance at Nangong Xiaolin. Seeing that, a trace of anger flashed through Nangong Xiaolin's eyes. However, Xiaoluan ignored it and turned her head to look at Nangongguan. "Everything that Nangong Xiaolin said just now, I can only say that you're twisting the truth and are shameless." In Nangong Xiaolin's words, Xiaoluan was a person who relied on her status and background to do whatever she wanted in the inner court. Of course, Xiaoluan wouldn't admit to that. Hearing Xiaoluan's words, Nangong Xiaolin immediately shouted coldly, "Xiaoluan, I think you're the one twisting the truth. Did I say anything wrong about what you did in the inner court?" Nangong Xiaolin, you know the truth better than I do. There's no need to put on an act here." Hearing that, Xiaoluan coldly smiled and looked at Nangong Xiaolin with disdain. "Please add, please vote, please recommend." The error-free chapters of Sword Master 8 Desolation will continue to be updated in the hand fighting bar. There will be no advertisements on the website. Please add and recommend the hand fighting bar. If you like Sword Master 8 Desolation, please add Sword Master 8 Desolation. Chapter 2250. While Xiaoluan and Nangong Xiaolin were arguing in the law enforcement hall, Guling Yao and Hong Xiu personally went to the law enforcement hall out of worry. However, Xiaochen had been extremely calm the entire time. One could even say that he did not care. Tianyu walked up to Xiaochen angrily and asked through gritted teeth, "Are you really not going to care about Luan Luan?" From Tianyu's point of view, Xiaoluan was Xiaochen's daughter. Furthermore, Tianyu knew Xiaoluan's character well. She would not kill someone for no reason, let alone someone from the same sect. Growing up in the sword sect, Xiaoluan's feelings for the sword sect were unimaginable. Tianyu did not understand what Xiaochen was thinking. Hearing this, Xiaochen gently pulled Tianyu over and sat her down beside him. He smiled and said gently, "Don't worry. Luan Luan is my daughter. Of course, I know what she is and I believe in her." "Then why aren't you showing up?" Tianyu asked in confusion. After all, the child has grown up. There are some things that she needs to learn to face on her own. this incident may be a good experience for Wan Wan. It will let her know that in this world, other than strength, there are many things that are indispensable. With that, Xiaochen retracted his gaze and said to himself, you can't be too naive about some things. Alright, I won't interfere in this matter. You guys can do as you see fit. Tianyu did not understand what Xiaochen meant. However, Flower Fairy smiled and said, I'll go to the law enforcement hall. With that, the fairy of 100 flowers floated away. Looking at the departing figure of the fairy of 100 flowers, the corners of Xiaochen's mouth unconsciously curled into a smile. At the same time, he thought to himself, still too inexperienced. From Xiaochen's point of view, although Xiaowan had gone through a series of trials, she was still too inexperienced. While Xiaochen was sighing, Xiaowan recounted everything that had happened in the law enforcement hall. In Xiaowan's words, Nangong Xiulin became the person who abused her status and background to bully the weak. As for why she killed someone today, it was because Nangong Xiulin's cousin, who was also a direct descendant of the family Nangong, had forcefully humiliated an inner court female disciple. This made Xiaowan was furious and decided to kill Nangong Xiulin. Hearing that Nangong men had done something worse than a beast, Hong Xiao and Gu Lingyao's faces darkened. They felt that Xiao did the right thing. Xiao Wan deserved to be killed. However, in the face of Xiao Wan's words, Nangong Xiulin smiled faintly and said, ridiculous. What a joke. Xiao Wan, even if you're the daughter of the sect master, you can't confuse right and wrong like this. Xiulin SSS, Xiulins. Nangong Xiulin, you know whether I'm speaking the truth or not. Are you still going to deny it? Xiao Wan didn't expect that Nangong Xiulin would still deny it. However, Nangong Xiulin didn't care about Xiao Wan's anger. She even smiled coldly at Xiao Wan. It was as though she was saying, you're too inexperienced to fight with me. Nangong Xiulin turned to Nangong Guan and said with grief and indignation, Vice Sect Master, Xiao Wan is slandering and framing me. I hope Vice Sect Master can uphold justice for me. Nangong Xiulin actually took the initiative to complain. Xiao Wan couldn't help but scold her. Nangong Xiulin, don't you have any shame? Xiao Wan didn't expect Nangong Xiulin to be so thick-skinned and still refused to admit it. However, Nangong Guan said calmly, Xiao Wan, since you said that Nangong Xiulin and Nangong Min bullied others in the inner court, and that you killed Nangong Min because he raped a female disciple, do you have any evidence? Since Xiaochen said that he would let the law enforcement hall handle this matter, Nangong Guan would naturally be impartial. She wouldn't side with Nangong Xiulin or Xiao Wan. If that was the case, Xiao Wan would need to show evidence. Hearing Nangong Guan's words, Xiao Wan said coldly, Vice Sect Master, you can bring that female inner court disciple here. Then you'll know whether I'm speaking the truth or not. Xiao Wan had personally witnessed Nangong Min humiliating that female disciple. That was why she was so angry that she killed Nangong Min. In Xiao Wan's opinion, as long as she brought that female disciple here, the truth would be revealed. Nangong Xiulin sneered when she heard Xiao Wan's words. She didn't seem worried at all. Nangong Guan said in a deep voice, fine. Bring that female disciple here. Soon, the female disciple that Xiao Wan said was humiliated by Nangong Min was brought to the law enforcement hall. She was quite pretty. Although she wasn't an outstanding beauty, she was still pretty. Nangong Guan looked at the female disciple and asked, Xiao Wan, you said that you were humiliated by Nangong Min. I'm asking you now. Is that true? Xiao Wan was very confident in Nangong Guan's question. She believed that the truth was about to be revealed. However, what Xiao Wan didn't expect was that after hearing Nangong Guan's question, the female disciple actually shook her head. Vice Sect Master, Nangong Min didn't humiliate a disciple. Xiao Wan's expression changed when she heard those words. She looked at the female disciple in disbelief. Today, she clearly saw Nangong Min humiliating that female disciple with her own eyes. It could even be said that Xiao Wan killed Nangong Min because the female disciple asked for help. But now, in front of Nangong Guan, the female disciple actually denied that Nangong men had humiliated her. Xiao Luan looked at the female disciple in disbelief. She was speechless for a long time. However, at this time, Nangong Shilin loudly said, "Vice Sect Master, please uphold justice for this disciple." Nangong Shilin was obviously making false accusations. However, Nangong Guan ignored him and looked at the female disciple with a dignified expression. "Do you know where this place is?" "I know," the female disciple replied with a nod. "Then do you know the consequences of lying here?" "I know," the female disciple replied again. "Good. Very good. Since you know, then I'll ask you again. Did Nangong Min humiliate you today?" Nangong Guan asked again. Faced with Nangong Guan's question again, the female disciple's face became even paler. However, after a long silence, she gritted her teeth and shook her head. "Vice Sect Master, Nangong Min didn't humiliate me." "He didn't?" Hearing those words, Xiao Luan felt like the world was spinning. She didn't understand why this female disciple would lie. She was clearly humiliated by Nangong Min. Chapter 2251. Xiao Luan didn't understand why this female disciple would say such a thing. She was clearly raped by Nangong Min, and Xiao Luan had only killed Nangong Min to save her. Xiao Luan didn't understand why this female disciple would say such a thing. She was clearly raped by Nangong Min, and Xiao Luan had only killed Nangong Min to save her. But now, in front of Nangong Guan, Guling Yao, Hong Xiu, and the others, this female disciple actually flatly denied it all. Xiao Luan still remembered how terrified this female disciple was when she first met her. But now, it had turned out like this. Xiao Luan didn't expect things to turn out like this. Nangong Shilin smiled and said loudly, "The truth is clear." Xiao Luan relied on her status to wantonly kill her fellow disciples. "Vice Sect Master, please uphold justice for us." Nangong Shilin took the opportunity to shout. Hearing this, Xiao Luan's face turned red. She looked at Nangong Shilin angrily and said, "Nonsense. The truth is clearly not like this." Xiao Luan was indeed too inexperienced. She didn't expect this female disciple to flatly deny everything. Now, without any evidence, Xiao Luan had killed her fellow disciples for no reason. Nangong Shilin sneered inwardly at the infuriated yet helpless Xiao Luan. Such an inexperienced girl actually wanted to fight with her. Justice in this world wasn't as simple as it seemed on the surface. This female disciple had indeed been raped by Nangong Min, and the truth was as Xiao Luan had said. But so what? Nangong Shilin had 100 ways to make this female disciple not dare to tell the truth. She didn't dare to tell the whole story. Xiao Luan knew too little about the dark side of the world and the darkness of people's hearts. She never would have thought that the female disciple she had saved would make such a false accusation. It had to be said that Nangong Shilin's move had stunned Xiao Luan. Nangong Shilin sneered at Xiao Luan and said unhurriedly, "Junior Sister Xiao, what do you mean by this?" "Junior Sister Xiao, what do you mean by that? Could it be that you still want to twist the truth and confuse the truth with the witness and material evidence?" Nangong Xiu had a righteous expression on his face. It was as if he was the righteous party. Facing that, Xiao Luan was furious. However, she simply didn't know how to refute him. That was because she didn't know how to handle the current situation. Looking at the helpless Xiao Luan, Guling Yao and Hong Xiu also frowned. The two of them unconsciously looked at the female disciple kneeling on the ground. The female disciple's face was pale. Clearly, she was extremely terrified. The two ladies had followed Xiao Chen all the way from the 8 Desolates world to the Great Thousand World. They had experienced much more than Xiao Luan, so they could naturally tell that something was fishy. He was certain that this female disciple did not dare to speak the truth for some reason. The truth seemed to have been made clear, and now everyone was waiting for Nandongguan to make the final decision and decide who would bear the responsibility for this matter. From the current situation, the one who was in the wrong was undoubtedly Xiao Wan. That was because she couldn't produce any evidence at all. On the other hand, Nangong Xiaolin had both witness and material evidence. Seeing that Xiao Wan was forced into a corner, a woman in a white dress slowly walked in from outside the courtyard. She had a gentle and moving temperament. She was Xiao Wan's second mother, Hundred Flower Fairy. Hundred Flower Fairy's appearance shocked everyone present. Even Nandongguan, who was sitting on the main seat, stood up and called out, "Second Madam." Facing Nandongguan's greeting, Hundred Flower Fairy revealed a faint smile and bowed, "Senior brother Nandong." Compared to when she faced Gu Lingyao and Hong Xiu, Nandongguan was clearly more serious. From Nandongguan's point of view, although Hundred Flower Fairy and the other two all had the same temperament as Xiao Chen, Gu Lingyao and Hong Xiu were far inferior to Hundred Flower Fairy in certain aspects. As Xiao Chen's second wife, Nandongguan was very clear on how terrifying Hundred Flower Fairy was. She was a woman with monstrous wisdom and was very intelligent. She was far superior to Hong Xiu and Gu Lingyao. Hundred Flower Fairy's arrival made Nandongguan feel that there might be a change in the situation. Gu Lingyao and Hong Xiu also stood up and walked in front of Hundred Flower Fairy, their expressions somewhat unfriendly. "Elder sister, the situation is a bit difficult to handle." Gu Lingyao and Hong Xiulin were present the entire time. It could be said that the current situation was extremely unfavorable for Xiao Wan. However, Hundred Flower Fairy still smiled and said, "Don't worry, I'm here." After saying this, Hundred Flower Fairy turned to look at the aggrieved Xiao Wan, then glanced at the somewhat dazed Nandong Xiulin, and finally fixed her gaze on the female disciple. Hundred Flower Fairy didn't care about a junior like Nandong Xiulin at all. However, when facing Hundred Flower Fairy, Nandong Xiulin didn't know why, but she couldn't help but feel nervous. In Nandong Xiulin's eyes, Hundred Flower Fairy was an extremely beautiful woman. Although Gu Lingyao and Hong Xiu were also very beautiful, in terms of temperament, Hundred Flower Fairy was completely different from them. However, it was Hundred Flower Fairy's temperament that caused Nandong Xiulin to be shocked. Of course, Nandong Xiulin wasn't a fool. She knew that Hundred Flower Fairy wasn't a woman she could covet, so she only gave her an infatuated glance before hurriedly retracting her gaze. Hundred Flower Fairy didn't care about the change in Nandong Xiulin's expression at all. She turned to Nandongguan and said indifferently, "Senior brother Nandong, may I ask a few questions?" "Of course." "Second Madam, please." Nandongguan replied straightforwardly. With Nandongguan's permission, Hundred Flower Fairy walked in front of the female disciple. Although she was also a woman, when facing Hundred Flower Fairy, the female disciple was dazed. She sighed in her heart. There was actually such a perfect woman in this world. Compared to Hundred Flower Fairy, even she felt inferior. Hundred Flower Fairy didn't release any aura, nor did she try to pressure the female disciple. Hundred Flower Fairy walked in front of the female disciple and said indifferently, "East Sword City's Zhou Clan's young miss, Zhou Yuan. Your father is called Zhou Qiang, right?" Hearing Hundred Flower Fairy's words, Zhou Yuan's expression changed. Nandong Xiulin's expression also became serious. She immediately revealed Zhou Yuan's identity. In response, Zhou Yuan silently nodded. Seeing this, Hundred Flower Fairy indifferently glanced at Nandong Xiulin and said, "Your father seemed to have lost his way. However, he just so happened to be met by my people. Now, he has safely returned home." Hundred Flower Fairy's words made Xiao Wan at a loss. He didn't understand what she meant at all. However, hearing this, Zhou Yuan and Nandong Xiulin's expressions greatly changed. Especially Nandong Xiulin. Her face instantly became gloomy, and cold sweat continuously appeared on her forehead. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. That you're tuning into the Mythic Realms YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.